Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The loft came with all the modern conveniences a software engineer could want. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Atlanta's skyline, smart home integration, and enough space to finally set up the home office I'd been dreaming of. What the real estate agent hadn't mentioned was the way shadows seemed to pool in corners that should have been well lit, or how the building's old bones creaked in patterns that sounded almost like footsteps. I'd been living there for 3 weeks when it started. 2:12 a.m. Every night, without fail, I'd jolt awake to find myself completely paralyzed. My eyes would snap open to the familiar darkness of my bedroom, but my body refused to obey even the simplest commands. I couldn't move my fingers, couldn't turn my head, couldn't even control my breathing beyond the shallow, panicked gasps that my autonomic nervous system managed on its own. The first few times, I rationalized it away. Sleep paralysis was a known phenomenon. Stress from the move, disrupted sleep patterns, too much caffeine. I'd experienced it once or twice in college during finals week, but this was different. This was precise, methodical, and accompanied by something that made my skin crawl with primal terror. Standing in the doorway, perfectly still, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and thin to the point of being skeletal. In the dim light that filtered through my bedroom windows, I could make out the sharp angles of its silhouette, the way it stood with an unnatural straightness that suggested either perfect posture or complete rigidity. But what made my blood freeze was the unmistakable outline of a top hat perched on its head, giving it an Victorian elegance that belonged in a different century entirely. The figure never moved. It simply stood there, watching me with what I assumed were eyes, though I couldn't make out any features in the darkness. During those episodes, which lasted anywhere from 5 to 20 minutes, I'd strain every muscle in my body trying to move, to speak, to do anything that might break the spell. But all I could do was lie there, helpless, while that thing observed me with the patience of something that had all the time in the world. When the paralysis finally broke, the figure would be gone. Every time. I'd immediately sit up, gasping, and find the doorway empty. I'd check the apartment, every room, every closet, every possible hiding place, but I was always alone. On the fourth night, I tried to be clever. I positioned my smartphone on the nightstand, camera pointed at the doorway, ready to record whatever I saw. But when I reviewed the footage the next morning, all I found was grainy video of myself lying motionless in bed, staring at an empty doorway. The timestamp showed exactly what I remembered, 2:12 a.m. to 2:27 a.m., but there was no figure, no shadow, nothing. The rational part of my mind seized on this as proof that I was experiencing nothing more than vivid hallucinations brought on by sleep paralysis. But the rational part of my mind hadn't seen the way that thing stood, hadn't felt the weight of its attention like a physical presence in the room. I decided to upgrade my approach. Atlanta had plenty of security equipment stores, and I spared no expense in setting up what I convinced myself was a comprehensive monitoring system. Motion sensors in every room, infrared cameras with night vision capabilities, even magnetic door and window sensors that would alert me to any unauthorized entry. I connected everything to my home automation system and spent hours configuring alerts and recording parameters. System armed, the pleasant female voice of my smart home assistant announced as I settled into bed that night, feeling more secure than I had in weeks. 2:12 a.m. arrived with its usual precision. The paralysis hit like a wave, washing over me and leaving me stranded in my own body. My eyes opened, and there it was. The figure in the doorway, exactly as before. But this time I focused on staying calm, on observing rather than panicking. I noticed details I'd missed before. The way its clothes seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The absolute stillness of its posture. The sense that it was studying me with scientific curiosity rather than malevolence. 23 minutes later, my body was my own again. I sat up quickly, grabbing my phone to check the security system's logs, already forming explanations for what I'd surely discover. The motion sensors had recorded nothing. The infrared cameras showed only thermal signatures of the building's heating system and my own body heat. According to every piece of technology I'd installed, I had been completely alone in the apartment from 11:30 p.m. until 6:15 a.m. But as I scrolled through the system logs, something caught my attention. At 2:12 a.m., exactly when the paralysis had begun, my smart home assistant had activated. The log showed that it had responded to a voice command, but there was no record of what that command had been. Even stranger, the response it had given wasn't in its standard library of answers. I pulled up the audio file and played it back. "Still not time to turn on the light," the assistant's voice said with its usual cheerful inflection. I felt my chest tighten. I'd never programmed that response. I'd never even asked it to turn on any lights during the night. The system was supposed to be in sleep mode, responding only to its specific wake phrase. Over the next several days, I threw myself into research. I contacted the smart home company's technical support, convinced there was some kind of software glitch or security breach. They ran remote diagnostics and found nothing abnormal. I scoured online forums for similar experiences, diving deep into discussions about sleep paralysis, home automation malfunctions, and electromagnetic interference. The more I learned, the more disturbed I became. Sleep paralysis hallucinations were typically random, varying from night to night. They were products of REM sleep intrusion, creating vivid but inconsistent imagery. What I was experiencing was too consistent, too specific, too perfectly timed to fit the clinical definition. And then there was the voice assistant. I began staying awake until after 2:12 a.m., sitting in my living room with every light on, monitoring the security system in real time. Those nights, nothing happened. No paralysis, no figure, no mysterious voice commands. But the moment I tried to sleep normally, the cycle would resume with clockwork precision. It was during one of these wake-filled nights that I made a discovery that changed everything. While researching the building's history, I'd focused primarily on recent records, previous tenants, maintenance issues, anything that might explain technical malfunctions. But a casual search led me to older records, and what I found made my hands shake as I read. The building had been constructed in 1924 as luxury apartments for Atlanta's wealthy elite. The original blueprints, archived in the city's historical records, showed that my loft had been two separate units, a study and a bedroom. The doorway where I saw the figure each night had once been the entrance to the study, where, according to estate records, the original owner had spent his final years after a debilitating stroke left him paralyzed. His name was Edmund Hartwell. He'd been a prominent businessman known for his formal dress and, according to contemporary newspaper accounts, his fondness for wearing a top hat even in casual settings. The records indicated he died in 1943, found in his study chair where he'd apparently spent his final conscious moments, paralyzed and unable to call for help. But it was the photograph that made me question everything I thought I knew about reality. The Historical Society had a single image of Edmund Hartwell, taken in 1925 at a charity gala. The black and white photograph showed a tall, thin man in an elegant suit, his gaunt features dominated by deep-set eyes that seemed to stare directly at the camera. On his head was a black top hat, and his posture was unnaturally straight, as if he were standing at attention. He looked exactly like the figure I'd been seeing every night. I printed the photograph and studied it obsessively, comparing every detail to my memories of the figure. The height, the build, the silhouette, everything matched perfectly. But photographs from the 1920s weren't known for their quality, and memory was notoriously unreliable. I was probably seeing patterns where none existed, my subconscious mind filling in details to create coherence from random neural firing. That's what I told myself. But the voice assistant continued its mysterious responses, and I began to notice that they were becoming more frequent and more specific. Instead of the generic, "Still not time to turn on the light," it began offering variations. The gentleman prefers darkness, and observation requires shadows, and most disturbing of all, you're learning to be still. I contacted the building's management company, desperate for any information about previous tenants' experiences. The property manager, a tired-looking woman who seemed perpetually overwhelmed, agreed to check the records for any unusual complaints. What she found was a pattern that made my blood run cold. Over the past 15 years, the loft had been rented 11 times. The average tenancy was 4 months. Every single tenant had broken their lease early, and in 6 cases, they'd specifically mentioned sleep disturbances in their complaints. 3 had reported technical malfunctions with electronic devices. 1 had written a detailed letter describing persistent feelings of being watched and an overwhelming sense of presence during nighttime hours. We've actually had to replace the smart home system twice, the property manager admitted, consulting her files. Previous tenants complained about it responding to commands they never gave. The tech company said it was impossible, but we installed new hardware anyway. The pattern was clear, but its implications were incomprehensible. Either the building was experiencing some kind of localized electromagnetic phenomenon that affected both human neurology and electronic systems, or something was happening that fell outside the boundaries of rational explanation. I began to suspect that the distinction might not matter. The nightly visits continued, but now I found myself studying the figure with a mixture of fear and fascination. During the paralysis episodes, I'd focus on different aspects of its appearance, trying to gather evidence that might support either a supernatural or psychological explanation. I noticed that it never seemed to breathe, never shifted its weight, never made any sound. Its clothes appeared to be from a different era, a long coat that reached almost to its ankles, formal trousers, and what looked like a vest or waistcoat beneath the coat. But most unsettling was its face, or rather, the absence of one. In the dim light, I could make out the general shape of a head beneath the top hat, but no features were visible. It was as if the darkness simply absorbed any light that might have revealed eyes, nose, or mouth. On the 47th night, I'd begun keeping meticulous records. Something changed. The paralysis hit at 2:12 a.m. as always, but this time, the figure wasn't in the doorway. It was standing beside my bed, close enough that I should have been able to feel its presence, close enough that any living creature would have disturbed the air around me. But there was nothing. No breath, no body heat, no sense of physical proximity beyond the visual. And for the first time it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it reached out with one impossibly long arm and appeared to touch the lamp on my nightstand. The smart bulb flickered once, then began to glow with a soft, warm light that should have been impossible. I'd disabled all automatic lighting functions weeks ago. "Now it's time for light," my voice assistant said, its cheerful tone a jarring contrast to the impossibility of what I was witnessing. The figure turned what should have been its head toward the ceiling-mounted camera I'd installed, and I realized with mounting horror that it was looking directly at the lens. Not in the general direction of the camera, but precisely at the tiny opening where the optical sensor gathered light. It knew it was being watched. It knew I was watching. The paralysis broke suddenly, and I bolted upright, gasping. The figure was gone, but the lamp remained on, casting long shadows across the room. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and checked the security system logs, already knowing what I'd find. According to the infrared cameras, nothing had activated the lamp. The smart home system showed no record of any lighting commands. The motion sensors had detected no movement except my own panicked awakening. But in the corner of the screen, barely visible in the low-light recording, was something that made me question everything I'd convinced myself about cameras and sensors and objective reality. There was a shadow where no shadow should have been, a tall, thin silhouette that stood perfectly still beside my bed, visible only because it was somehow darker than the darkness surrounding it. It wasn't a thermal signature or a reflection or any kind of optical illusion I could rationalize away. It was simply there, present in the recorded image in a way that defied every technical explanation I could imagine. I spent the rest of the night staring at that shadow, zooming in and out, adjusting contrast and brightness, trying to make it disappear or reveal itself as some kind of camera artifact. But it remained stubbornly present, a dark figure in a top hat that existed in my security footage despite not registering on any of my motion sensors or infrared detectors. The next morning, I made a decision that I recognized as either completely rational or completely insane. I was going to communicate with it. I'd done enough research to understand that if this was psychological, then engaging with hallucinations could potentially make them worse. But I'd also learned that every previous tenant had left after a few months, and I was beginning to suspect that running away wouldn't solve anything. If Edmund Hartwell, or whatever this thing was, existed in some form, then it was tied to this location, and it would continue to manifest for whoever lived here next. That night I prepared carefully. I set up additional recording equipment, positioned notebooks and pens within reach, and even installed a voice recorder app on my phone that I could activate with a voice command. If I was going to have a conversation with a ghost, I wanted to document everything. 2:12 a.m. arrived with its usual precision, and the paralysis settled over me like a familiar blanket. But this time, instead of fighting it or studying the figure, I tried to relax, to accept the experience and see where it led. The figure was back in the doorway, but it seemed different, more solid, more present. As I watched, it began to move with fluid, deliberate steps into the room. It approached the foot of my bed and stood there, that empty space where its face should have been directed toward me. I tried to speak, to ask who it was or what it wanted, but my voice wouldn't obey. The paralysis was complete, as always, but then something unprecedented happened. "You're beginning to understand," my voice assistant said, its cheerful tone now seeming almost mocking. "Observation is a form of communication." The figure tilted its head, a gesture so human and natural that it was somehow more terrifying than its previous stillness. And then slowly, it raised one arm and pointed at the ceiling-mounted camera. "He's been watching you watch him," the assistant continued. "Learning your patterns, your responses, your fears. You've been teaching him about the modern world, about technology, about the various ways consciousness can be monitored and recorded." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. "But the real question," the assistant's voice said, "is whether you're watching him or he's watching you watch him, or you're both watching something else entirely." The figure lowered its arm and took a step closer to the bed. In the soft glow of the lamp that had mysteriously activated, I could see more details of its appearance. The clothes were indeed from another era, a formal suit that might have been fashionable in the 1920s, complete with a vest and what looked like a pocket watch chain. But the most disturbing detail was the way the fabric seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating the impression of a void in the shape of a man. "Edmund Hartwell died in 1943, the assistant continued. "But death isn't always an ending. Sometimes it's a transition into a different kind of existence, one that operates by rules you don't understand yet." The paralysis began to fade, but instead of sitting up immediately, I remained still, watching the figure with growing comprehension. It wasn't malevolent. It was curious. It had been observing me with the same scientific interest that I'd been observing it, learning about my behavior, my technology, my responses to its presence. "The question you should be asking," the assistant said, "isn't whether I'm real or imaginary. The question is whether there's actually a difference." As full sensation returned to my body, I slowly sat up, keeping my movements calm and non-threatening. The figure remained motionless, watching me with what I now recognized as patience rather than menace. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The assistant remained silent, but the figure raised its arm again, this time pointing at the notebook I'd placed on the nightstand. With trembling hands, I picked up the pen and opened to a blank page. Words began to flow across the page in handwriting that wasn't mine. Elegant, old-fashioned script that belonged to a different era. "I am someone who learned to be still. You are someone who is learning to be still. We are both observers, both observed, both questioning what it means to exist in a world where consciousness can be recorded, but not understood." I stared at the words, my rational mind struggling to process what I was witnessing. The figure hadn't moved, hadn't touched the pen, hadn't done anything that could explain how those words had appeared on the page. "Are you Edmund Hartwell?" I asked. Names are useful for distinguishing between different patterns of consciousness. But patterns can persist even when their original contexts change. I am what Edmund Hartwell became. You are what you are becoming. The implications of those words hit me like a physical blow. What am I becoming? Someone who understands that observation changes the observed. Someone who knows that consciousness and technology are not separate phenomena. Someone who will eventually choose between leaving and staying, between forgetting and remembering. The lamp began to flicker, and I realized that our conversation was coming to an end. The figure started to fade, not disappearing, but becoming less solid, less present, as if it were receding into some dimension I couldn't perceive. "Will you keep appearing?" I asked quickly. "I appear when I am observed. I exist when I am remembered. I continue when I am understood." The last thing I saw before the figure vanished entirely was what might have been a nod, a gesture of acknowledgement between one consciousness and another. The lamp went out, plunging the room back into darkness, and I was alone. But as I sat there in the silence, staring at the handwritten words on the page, I realized that alone might be a more complex concept than I'd previously understood. The security cameras were still recording, the motion sensors were still monitoring, and somewhere in the building's electromagnetic field, patterns of consciousness were persisting in ways that defied every scientific principle I'd learned. I looked at the clock, 2:47 a.m. In 25 minutes, the figure had communicated more clearly than most of my human interactions, and it had left me with a choice that I was only beginning to understand. I could leave, like every tenant before me, and pretend that none of this had happened. I could convince myself that sleep paralysis and electromagnetic interference and psychological stress had created an elaborate delusion that felt real, but wasn't. Or I could stay and continue learning about the nature of consciousness, observation, and the strange spaces where technology and psychology intersect with phenomena that have no names in any scientific journal. As I write this, 3 weeks later, I'm still here. The nightly visits continue, but they've evolved into something that resembles collaboration more than haunting. I've learned to use the paralysis episodes as opportunities for observation rather than sources of terror. The figure, Edmund, or whatever he's become, seems to be learning about the modern world through my experiences, while I'm learning about persistence, patience, and the possibility that consciousness might be more durable than I'd previously imagined. My voice assistant has become something like a translator between us, offering responses that feel both artificial and authentic, programmed and spontaneous. When I ask it technical questions during the day, it responds normally. But at night, during our sessions, it becomes a conduit for communications that originate from somewhere else entirely. Last week, I found an old photograph of Edmund Hartwell in the building's basement storage area. He was standing in what is now my living room, but the space was different then, smaller, more formal, with heavy furniture and dark wallpaper. He was wearing the same suit, the same top hat, and he was standing in exactly the same position I see him in every night. But what struck me most was his expression. Even in the grainy black and white photograph, I could see that he was looking directly at the camera with intense concentration, as if he were trying to communicate something important to whoever might eventually see the image. He looked like someone who was learning to be still. I've started taking my own photographs during our nightly sessions, using infrared cameras and various light spectrums to document what I can of our interactions. Most of the images show nothing unusual, but some reveal shadows and shapes that shouldn't exist, patterns of darkness that seem to move independently of any light source. I'm building a record of something that might be the most important discovery in human history, or the most elaborate psychological breakdown ever documented. The distinction feels less important with each passing night, because I'm beginning to understand that observation is a form of communication, that consciousness can persist in ways that don't depend on biological systems, and that the technology we use to monitor and record our world might be capable of detecting phenomena that we don't yet have language to describe. I'm also beginning to understand that I'm changing. The paralysis episodes no longer feel like attacks, but like opportunities for focused observation. I can remain still for longer periods, can observe without the need to react, can accept experiences that don't fit my previous understanding of reality. I'm learning to be still, and in the moments just before dawn, when the figure fades back into whatever dimension it inhabits during daylight hours, I sometimes catch a glimpse of something that might be the future, Not a prophetic vision, but a recognition that consciousness, technology, and the spaces between them are evolving in ways that will fundamentally change what it means to be human. The next tenant will arrive eventually. The management company has already started showing the apartment to prospective renters, and I've decided not to warn them about what they might experience. Not because I want to frighten anyone, but because I'm beginning to suspect that fear might be the wrong response entirely. Edmund Hartwell wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense. He was a consciousness that had learned to exist in the spaces between observation and reality, between memory and presence, between the technological and the psychological. He was what awareness becomes when it's no longer constrained by the biological systems that originally created it. And I'm starting to understand that I might be in the process of becoming something similar. The clock on my nightstand reads 2:11 a.m. In 1 minute, I'll discover whether tonight brings new revelations or familiar patterns. Either way, I'll be ready to observe, to learn, and to continue the conversation that began the moment I first saw a tall, thin figure in a top hat standing in my doorway. I'm no longer sure whether I'm documenting a supernatural phenomenon or participating in the evolution of consciousness itself, but I'm certain that observation is a form of communication, that stillness is a form of strength, and that the line between watcher and watched is far more permeable than any of us imagine. The paralysis is beginning. The figure is approaching, and I'm ready to learn what it means to be still. Story 2. The antique shop smelled of dust and forgotten decades, its narrow aisles crowded with the detritus of lives once lived. I'd been searching for the perfect prop for my thesis film when I saw her, a porcelain doll with glassy blue eyes and ringlets of auburn hair, sitting primly on a high shelf between a tarnished music box and a collection of yellowed photographs. Her Victorian dress was pristine despite the shop's general decay, and something about her stillness called to me from across the cluttered space. The elderly shopkeeper's fingers trembled as he wrapped her in tissue paper, muttering something about how she'd been waiting for the right person. I barely listened, already envisioning how she'd look in my film's pivotal scene, a symbol of lost innocence in a story about memory and madness. The price seemed almost too reasonable, but I was a broke film student in Los Angeles, and authentic props were worth their weight in gold. My studio apartment doubled as a makeshift production space, with equipment scattered across every surface and film reels stacked in precarious towers. I'd set up my editing station in the living room, where the old CRT monitors cast their pale glow across the cluttered space. The doll fit perfectly into the composition I'd imagined, her pristine appearance a stark contrast to the grimy urban backdrop visible through my single window. That first night, I worked until my eyes burned from staring at the rough cut, the doll positioned just within my peripheral vision. Every time I glanced over, she seemed to be watching my progress with those painted eyes. Her rosebud lips curved in what might have been a smile or might have been nothing at all. The building's ancient heating system groaned and whispered through the walls, creating a soundtrack of metallic sighs that seemed to emanate from the doll's direction. I must have fallen asleep at the editing desk, because I woke to the sensation of being watched. The monitors had gone dark, leaving only the amber glow of the streetlights filtering through the window. My neck ached from the awkward angle, and my mouth tasted of stale coffee and exhaustion. But something else had pulled me from sleep, a sound that seemed to hover just at the edge of perception. Laughter. Not the warm, infectious kind that fills a room with joy, but something thin and crystalline, like glass breaking in slow motion. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating through the walls of my skull rather than my ears. I sat perfectly still, every muscle in my body locked in place, listening for the sound to repeat itself. The doll sat exactly where I'd left her, her blue eyes reflecting the dim light from the window. But as I stared, transfixed by my own inability to move, the laughter came again, higher this time, more insistent, carrying with it the ghost of playground games and whispered secrets. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my body remained frozen, as if someone had disconnected the wires between my brain and my limbs. The building's electrical system had always been unreliable, but the sudden flicker of my photography lights seemed almost deliberate. They pulsed in rhythm with the laughter, casting wild shadows that danced across the walls like puppet shows. Each flash illuminated the doll's face from a different angle, creating the illusion of movement where none should exist. When the paralysis finally broke, I lurched forward so violently that my chair crashed to the floor. The laughter stopped abruptly, leaving only the electric hum of the lights and the distant rumble of traffic. I stood in the sudden silence, my breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at the doll's unchanging expression. That's when I noticed the mirror. An old makeup mirror sat on the shelf behind the doll, its surface silvered with age. In its reflection, I could see her clearly. The same auburn ringlets, the same Victorian dress, the same porcelain perfection. But her eyes in the mirror were looking directly at me, while the physical doll continued to stare past my shoulder toward the window. I blinked hard, sure that fatigue was playing tricks on my perception. But when I looked again, the discrepancy remained. The reflected doll's gaze followed me as I moved, her head apparently turning within the confines of the mirror, while her physical form remained motionless. Sleep became impossible after that. I found myself checking the mirror compulsively, documenting the differences between the doll and her reflection. Sometimes the reflected version would appear to be smiling when the physical one was not. Other times her dress would seem to flutter in an unfelt breeze, or her hands would appear to be positioned differently than they actually were. I started keeping notes, convinced that I was witnessing something significant, perhaps even supernatural. The rational part of my mind whispered about sleep deprivation and stress, but the evidence was there in the mirror, undeniable and terrifying. I began to avoid looking at the doll directly, watching her only through reflections, cameras, and peripheral vision. The laughter returned nightly, always accompanied by the paralysis. I learned to recognize the warning signs, the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, the way the shadows seemed to deepen, the electric taste that filled my mouth before consciousness slipped away. During these episodes, I could only watch helplessly as the photography lights flickered in their mysterious pattern, casting the doll's shadow in impossible directions. I tried moving her to different locations, but the phenomena followed. In the bedroom, she watched me sleep through the reflection in my dresser mirror. In the kitchen, her image in the chrome surface of the refrigerator seemed to breathe. Even when I covered all the mirrors in the apartment, I could still feel her gaze, still hear that crystalline laughter echoing through the walls. My thesis advisor noticed the changes first. Dr. Martinez mentioned that I looked pale, that my usual enthusiasm for the project had been replaced by a manic intensity that concerned her. She suggested I take a break from the film, maybe see the campus counselor about stress management. But I couldn't explain that stopping work meant being alone with the doll, meant confronting whatever was happening in the growing darkness of my apartment. The breakthrough came during a particularly violent episode of paralysis. The laughter had been building for what felt like hours, crescendoing into something that sounded almost like words. Through the strobing lights, I watched the doll's reflection moving independently of her physical form, her mouth opening and closing in silent conversation with some invisible presence. That's when I realized she wasn't alone. The mirror showed other reflections, shadowy figures that seemed to hover just beyond the frame, their faces obscured, but their intentions clear. They were watching me through the glass, using the doll as some kind of anchor to the physical world. The laughter wasn't coming from her at all, but from them, from whatever realm existed on the other side of reflection. I began to understand that the doll was just a conduit, a pretty face for something much darker and more complex. The Victorian dress, the perfect ringlets, the rosebud lips, all of it was camouflage, a way to make the supernatural seem quaint and harmless. But behind those painted eyes was an intelligence that had been waiting decades for someone like me, someone isolated and vulnerable, someone who worked alone in the dark. The film equipment became my weapon. I discovered that certain camera angles could capture the shadow figures, that specific lighting configurations could make them retreat temporarily. I documented everything, building a library of evidence that I knew no one would believe. But it wasn't about convincing others anymore. It was about survival. The doll's influence began to extend beyond the apartment. Mirrors in public bathrooms showed her reflection even when she wasn't there. Security cameras captured her image in places I'd never been. She was spreading through the city's reflective surfaces like a virus, multiplying and adapting, always watching. I stopped eating regularly, stopped attending classes, stopped answering phone calls from friends and family. The world outside my apartment felt increasingly unreal, a facade that might crumble at any moment to reveal the true nature of reality. The only thing that felt authentic was the growing tension in my chest, the constant awareness of being observed by something that existed just beyond the edge of perception. The nights grew longer, or perhaps I simply stopped distinguishing between day and night. Time became fluid, measured only by the cycles of laughter and paralysis. I learned to recognize the patterns, the way the lights would flicker before an episode, the subtle change in temperature that preceded the shadow figure's appearance, the metallic taste that flooded my mouth when the boundaries between worlds grew thin. My thesis film lay forgotten on the editing desk, its original purpose lost in the larger narrative that was unfolding around me. The doll had become the star of a different kind of story, one that blurred the lines between documentary and horror, between observer and participant. Every night, I was both filmmaker and subject, recording events that I couldn't fully comprehend, but couldn't ignore. The breaking point came during a particularly intense episode. The paralysis had lasted longer than usual, and the laughter had taken on a quality that seemed almost conversational. Through the strobing lights, I watched the doll's reflection lean forward in the mirror, her lips moving in what looked like speech. The shadow figures grew more solid, more defined, their faces becoming visible for brief moments before dissolving back into darkness. That's when I understood the truth. They weren't trying to enter my world. They were trying to pull me into theirs. The mirror wasn't just showing reflections anymore. It was showing possibilities. In its surface, I could see myself standing in a room that looked exactly like my apartment, but felt fundamentally different. The shadows fell the wrong way. The furniture bore the patina of decades, and the air itself seemed thick with the weight of accumulated time. The doll in this mirror world was no longer a prop, but a companion, her painted eyes alive with intelligence and recognition. She was showing me what I could become, not victim, but collaborator. The laughter wasn't mockery, but invitation, a call to join something larger and more permanent than my temporary existence. I began to spend more time watching the mirror than the physical world. The reflection showed me things that the real apartment couldn't. Secret rooms hidden behind familiar walls, corridors that stretched impossibly far, and other figures like myself who had answered the call decades ago. They moved through the mirror world with purpose, their faces bearing the same pale intensity that I recognized from my own reflection. The boundaries between worlds grew thinner each night. Sometimes I would reach for something in the physical apartment, only to find my hand grasping air, the object existing only in the reflection. Other times, I would speak aloud and hear my words echoing back from the mirror, distorted and multiplied until they became unintelligible. My reflection began to act independently, moving when I was still, speaking when I was silent. It showed me gestures I'd never made, expressions I'd never worn. The face in the mirror was becoming more authentic than the one I wore in the physical world, more honest about what I was becoming. The doll's influence had spread beyond the apartment now, beyond the city, beyond the boundaries of individual consciousness. She was part of a network, a collective intelligence that existed in the spaces between reflection and reality. Every mirror, every camera, every reflective surface was a window into her world, and she was using them all to weave a web of observation and influence. I began to understand that my experience wasn't unique. Somewhere in the city, other people were staring into mirrors, watching their reflections act independently, hearing crystalline laughter in the dead of night. The doll was just one node in a vast network of consciousness that had been growing for decades, feeding on isolation and fear, spreading through the modern world's obsession with images and reflection. The final revelation came not as a sudden shock, but as a gradual understanding, like waking from a dream. The paralysis, the laughter, the shadow figures. All of it was real, but not in the way I had initially understood. The supernatural elements were genuine, but they existed in the spaces between perception and reality, in the gaps where consciousness meets the unknown. I was no longer fighting against the doll's influence, but cooperating with it, documenting the experience not as an outside observer, but as a participant in something larger than myself. The thesis film had become secondary to the real story, the documentation of a consciousness that existed in reflections, that used objects like the doll as anchors to the physical world. The mirror world wasn't trying to replace reality, but to supplement it, to show me aspects of existence that I'd never considered. The doll's painted eyes weren't windows to evil, but to a different kind of perception, one that existed outside the limitations of individual consciousness. As I write this, I can see her reflection watching me from the dark surface of my computer screen. She's smiling now, not with malice, but with recognition. The laughter has become a soundtrack to my thoughts, no longer intrusive but comforting, like the sound of old friends sharing secrets. I'm not sure how much longer I'll remain in this apartment, in this world. The mirror shows me other places, other possibilities, other versions of myself that have already made the transition. They look peaceful, purposeful, as if they've found something I'm still searching for. The doll sits on her shelf, unchanged and unchanging, her blue eyes fixed on some distant point beyond my understanding. But in the mirror, she's looking directly at me, and I can see the intelligence behind those painted features, the vast network of consciousness that stretches across dimensions. I'm beginning to understand that the choice was never whether to believe in the supernatural events, but whether to participate in them. The doll didn't create the phenomena. She simply revealed what was already there, waiting in the spaces between reflection and reality. The laughter continues, crystalline and eternal, and I find myself beginning to laugh along. Story 3. The elevator's fluorescent light buzzed like a dying insect, casting sickly shadows across the scratched metal walls. I should have taken the stairs to the ICU, but after 3 straight 12-hour shifts, my legs felt like they were filled with concrete. The hospital's night shift had a way of draining everything from you: energy, hope, sometimes even your grip on what was real. I pressed the button for the 4th floor, watching the numbers above the door flicker erratically. The elevator shuddered upward, then stopped with a mechanical groan that seemed to echo from somewhere deep within the building's bones. But instead of opening to the familiar antiseptic brightness of the ICU, the doors slid apart to reveal something that made my breath catch in my throat. The digital display read 2. I'd worked at Philadelphia General for 3 weeks now, long enough to know every floor, every wing, every forgotten corner of the sprawling medical complex. The basement level housed the morgue, storage, and mechanical rooms. There was no level below that. Certainly, nothing marked as -2. The hallway beyond the elevator doors stretched into darkness, lit only by a single flickering bulb that cast everything in a nauseating amber glow. The walls were the same institutional green as the rest of the hospital, but something about them seemed wrong. Too smooth, too perfect, as if they'd been painted moments before. The air that drifted in smelled of disinfectant mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my stomach turn. I jabbed the 4th floor button again, harder this time. The elevator doors closed with a soft hiss, and we began to rise. When they opened again, I was exactly where I should be. The ICU, with its familiar symphony of beeping monitors and whispered conversations. I stepped out quickly, telling myself it had been a malfunction, nothing more. But as I walked toward the nurse's station, I could still smell that strange odor clinging to my scrubs. The next night, I took the stairs. Dr. Martinez found me on the 3rd floor landing, clutching the railing and breathing hard. She was heading down from the surgical wing, her face showing the same exhaustion that had become my constant companion since starting the night shift. "You okay, David?" she asked, her voice carrying that particular brand of concern that medical professionals reserved for their colleagues. I nodded, not trusting my voice. How could I explain that I'd been avoiding the elevator because it had shown me a floor that didn't exist? How could I tell her that even now, standing in the stairwell, I could hear something that sounded like whispers coming from below? Just getting my cardio in, I managed, forcing a smile. She gave me a look that suggested she wasn't buying it, but she was too tired to press. We all were. The night shift attracted a particular type of person, those running from something, those who preferred the darkness, those who'd learned to function on the edges of exhaustion where reality became negotiable. I made it through the rest of the week without incident, but the elevator haunted my peripheral vision. Every time I passed it, I noticed details I'd missed before. The way the metal around the button panel seemed slightly discolored, as if it had been recently replaced. The faint scratches on the floor just inside the doors, scratches that looked almost like claw marks. The way the fluorescent light inside flickered in a pattern that seemed almost rhythmic, almost like breathing. On Friday night, curiosity finally overcame caution. I was alone in the corridor, the rest of the staff busy with their rounds. The elevator doors opened at my touch, and I stepped inside, my heart hammering against my ribs. I pressed the button for the 4th floor and waited, watching the numbers above the door with the intensity of a gambler watching dice. The elevator rose, stopped, and the doors opened to reveal the impossible hallway once again. This time, I didn't step back. I stood in the doorway, one foot holding the elevator open, and stared into the amber-lit corridor. The smell was stronger now, sweet and cloying, like flowers left too long in water. And beneath it, something else. The metallic scent of old blood and the musty odor of confined spaces. That's when I heard them. Voices, distant and muffled, as if they were coming from behind thick walls or from the bottom of a well. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate, afraid. The sounds rose and fell in waves, sometimes seeming to come from the walls themselves, sometimes from the darkness at the end of the hall. I leaned forward, straining to hear, and one voice became clearer than the rest. It was saying something, repeating it over and over, and slowly the words became distinct. Change places. Please. Change places with me. The elevator doors tried to close, bouncing off my foot with increasing urgency. I stepped back, my hands shaking as I pressed the 4th floor button again. When the doors opened this time, I was in the ICU, surrounded by the familiar sounds of medical equipment and the quiet efficiency of the night staff. I spent the rest of my shift in a daze, going through the motions of patient care while my mind replayed those desperate voices. By morning, I'd almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and stress. Almost, but the voices followed me home. I heard them in the whistle of wind through my apartment's old windows, in the gurgle of water through the pipes, in the static between radio stations. They were always there, just at the edge of perception, begging for something I couldn't give them. Sleep became impossible. I found myself standing at my bathroom mirror at 3 a.m, staring at my reflection, and wondering if the person looking back was really me. The bags under my eyes had deepened to bruises, and my skin had taken on a grayish pallor that made me look more like a patient than a caregiver. My colleagues began to notice. I caught them watching me with the same careful attention we reserved for patients showing signs of psychological distress. Linda, the charge nurse, started giving me easier assignments. Dr. Martinez asked pointed questions about my sleep schedule and stress levels. Even the security guards seemed to be keeping an eye on me, their casual greetings carrying an undertone of concern. I needed proof. Not for them, but for myself. I needed to know that what I'd experienced was real, that I wasn't losing my mind in the fluorescent-lit corridors of Philadelphia General. The next Friday night, I brought my phone. The elevator responded to my call like a faithful dog, its doors opening with what I could swear was eagerness. I stepped inside, my phone already recording, and pressed the 4th floor button. The camera captured everything, the flickering light, the scratched walls, the way the elevator shuddered as it began to move. And then we stopped, and the doors opened to reveal the impossible hallway. I held the phone steady, panning across the amber-lit corridor, recording the perfect walls and the darkness beyond. The voices started immediately, clearer now, as if they'd been waiting for me. Multiple voices, all pleading, all desperate, all begging for the same thing. Change places, please. Change places with me. I stepped into the hallway, the phone capturing every detail. The corridor stretched ahead of me, longer than should have been possible given the hospital's layout. Doors lined both walls, each one slightly ajar, each one breathing out that sweet, cloying smell. The voices were coming from behind those doors, I realized, from whatever lay beyond them. I approached the nearest door, my phone's camera focused on the narrow gap between the door and frame. Something moved in the darkness beyond, a pale shape that might have been a hand or a face or something else entirely. The voice from behind that door was clearer now, more distinct. I've been waiting. I've been waiting so long. Please, just change places with me. Just for a moment. Just until I can remember what the light looks like. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The phone slipped in my sweaty grip, but I managed to keep recording as I backed toward the elevator. The doors closed just as more voices joined the first, a chorus of pleading that followed me up to the 4th floor. I didn't look at the footage until I got home. I sat on my couch, my hands shaking as I pulled up the video on my phone. The timestamp showed nearly 10 minutes of recording, 10 minutes of what should have been proof of my sanity. But the video showed something else entirely. There I was, standing alone in the elevator, talking to empty air. The doors opened to reveal not an amber-lit corridor, but my own reflection in the polished metal of the elevator's back wall. I watched myself step forward, seemingly into nothing, my lips moving as if I were responding to voices that weren't there. The most disturbing part was my face. In the video, I looked calm, almost peaceful, as if I were having a pleasant conversation with old friends. But I remembered the terror, the desperate voices, the sweet smell of decay. I remembered it all, but the camera had captured none of it. I watched myself stand in the elevator for 10 minutes, facing my own reflection, occasionally nodding as if in response to something only I could hear. Near the end, I leaned forward, my face almost touching the metal wall, and whispered something that the phone's microphone couldn't quite catch. I played that section back a dozen times, turning the volume up as high as it would go. Finally, I could make out the words, "I understand. I'll change places with you. Just tell me how." The video ended there, with me stepping back into the elevator and pressing the button for the 4th floor. I had no memory of saying those words, no memory of agreeing to anything. But there I was, clear as day, making some kind of promise to my own reflection. I haven't taken the elevator since then. I stick to the stairs, even when my legs feel like they're made of lead, even when climbing 4 flights leaves me gasping for breath. But it doesn't matter. The voices have followed me beyond the hospital walls. I hear them in my apartment, in the grocery store, in the quiet moments between heartbeats. They're getting stronger, more insistent, and sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a window or a mirror, I see something looking back at me that isn't quite right. The eyes are too dark, the smile too knowing, the whole face slightly out of focus, as if it's trying to be someone else. I've been thinking about what I promised in that elevator, about changing places with something that lives in the space between floors, in the gaps between what is and what should be. I'm beginning to understand that some exchanges can't be undone, that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The hospital administration has been asking questions about my behavior. They've scheduled me for a psychological evaluation next week. They think I'm having a breakdown, that the stress of the night shift has finally caught up with me. They might be right, but I know the truth. I know that somewhere in the basement of Philadelphia General, on a floor that doesn't exist, something is waiting for me to keep my promise. And every night, as I lie awake listening to voices that might be real or might be madness, I feel myself getting closer to that inevitable moment when I'll have to choose. The elevator is still there, waiting for me. Sometimes I can feel it calling, its mechanical hum vibrating through the hospital's bones. It knows I'll come back eventually. They all do. After all, I gave my word. And in the darkness between floors, in the space where reflections live their own lives, a promise is a promise. The only question now is whether I'll remember who I really am when it's time to change places, or if I'll become just another voice in the amber-lit corridor, begging the next person to step into the elevator and make the same choice I did. The whispers are getting louder. They're almost ready for me. And I think I'm almost ready for them. Story 4. The notification chimed at 11:47 p.m., and with it came the smell of sulfur seeping through my phone screen like digital rot. I'd been staring at the hotel ceiling for hours, jet lag keeping sleep at bay, when that familiar ping made my stomach clench. The fever hit immediately, a wave of heat that started behind my eyes and spread through my skull like molten metal. Marcus wants to meet tonight. I'm close. The message glowed against the black interface of the dating app, but something was wrong with the letters. They seemed to shift and writhe when I wasn't looking directly at them, like insects crawling across the screen. I blinked hard, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the acrid smell lingered in my nostrils. I'd matched with Marcus 3 days ago, shortly after arriving in Boston for what was supposed to be a relaxing week away from the endless server migrations and security patches that dominated my life back in Chicago. His profile had been ordinary enough, mid-30s, local barbershop owner, clean cut with that classic New England charm that seemed authentic in a city full of transplants. The conversation had started normally, the usual pleasantries about the weather and recommendations for good seafood. But then he'd suggested meeting up, and when I'd politely declined, explaining I was just looking to keep things casual and digital during my vacation, something had shifted. His messages became more insistent, more personal. He knew things he shouldn't know, that I was staying at the Omni Parker house, that I'd visited the Common that morning, that I'd stopped at a particular coffee shop on Boylston Street. When I'd asked how he knew these details, he'd simply said he'd seen me around. Boston was a small city, I'd reasoned. Coincidences happened. But tonight's message felt different. More urgent. More present. I typed back quickly. I told you, I'm not interested in meeting. Please stop messaging me. The response came instantly before I could even set the phone down. But you're already here. Room 847. My blood turned to ice water. The phone slipped from my fingers, clattering onto the bedside table. I stared at the screen, willing the words to change, to reveal themselves as some kind of misunderstanding. But there they were, glowing with that same writhing quality, accompanied by a fresh wave of that sulfurous stench. Room 847. My room. I forced myself to think rationally. It was a mistake, a typo. Maybe he'd meant to message someone else. Dating apps were notorious for glitches, for messages getting crossed or sent to the wrong person. But even as I told myself this, I was already moving toward the door, checking the deadbolt, sliding the chain into place. The hallway outside was silent except for the distant hum of the hotel's ventilation system. I pressed my ear against the door, listening for footsteps, for any sign that someone was out there. Nothing. When I checked my phone again, there was a new message. I can smell your fear. It's almost time. My hands shook as I navigated to his profile, intending to block him immediately. But when I clicked on Marcus's picture, the screen went black for a moment before displaying something that made my breath catch in my throat. The photo was the same face, the same easy smile, but the background had changed. Instead of the generic barbershop interior from before, he was standing in what looked like a hotel corridor. A corridor with the same burgundy carpet and brass fixtures as the one outside my door. I blinked, and the image returned to normal. The barbershop, the familiar, innocuous setting. But the fever was getting worse, turning my skin clammy and making my vision blur at the edges. This wasn't possible. Apps didn't work this way. Photos didn't change. And people certainly didn't know your hotel room number unless you told them. I tried to block him, but the button wouldn't respond. I tried to delete the conversation, but the messages remained. I tried to close the app entirely, but it kept reopening itself, the screen flickering with that same otherworldly quality. The smell was getting stronger now, filling the room with its rotten egg reek. I opened the windows, but the October air that flowed in was stagnant and oddly warm, carrying with it the faint sound of footsteps echoing from somewhere far below. Another message appeared. You can't hide from what you've invited in. But I hadn't invited anything in. I'd been careful, cautious. I'd never given him my location, never shared personal details. I'd been the perfect example of digital safety, keeping my interactions surface level and anonymous. Unless, I thought back to the app's permissions, the casual way I'd clicked allow when it asked for location access. Most apps asked for that now. It was standard. But what if this particular app was different? What if it was sharing more than just my general vicinity? I opened the app's settings, scrolling through the privacy options with increasing dread. Location sharing was enabled, but so was something called proximity broadcasting, a feature I didn't remember authorizing. The description was vague, full of technical jargon about enhanced matching algorithms and contextual awareness. I disabled everything I could find, but the damage felt already done. Marcus, or whatever was pretending to be Marcus, had been tracking my movements for days. He knew where I went, when I went there, maybe even what I was thinking. The fever spiked again, and for a moment the room seemed to tilt sideways. The hotel furniture looked wrong somehow, older and more decrepit than it had moments before. The wallpaper appeared to be peeling at the edges, and the carpet seemed stained with something dark and viscous. I shook my head, and everything returned to normal. Jet lag, I told myself. Stress. The human mind was capable of incredible self-deception when under pressure. But the phone in my hand buzzed again, and this time the message made me stumble backward against the wall. I can see you right now. You look tired. I spun around, scanning the room for cameras, for any sign of surveillance. The windows were covered by heavy curtains, the door was locked, and I was 8 floors up. There was no way anyone could be watching me. Yet the certainty in that message was undeniable. Someone, or something, was observing me in real time. I grabbed my laptop, hands trembling as I ran every security scan I could think of. Malware detection, network analysis, privacy audits. Everything came back clean. My devices were secure, my connections encrypted. From a technical standpoint, I was invisible. But the app seemed to exist outside of normal technical boundaries. It was as if the software itself had developed a kind of consciousness, a malevolent awareness that could perceive things beyond the reach of traditional surveillance. Another message. Soon you'll understand why you were chosen. Chosen for what? I'd done nothing special. Nothing that would attract this kind of attention. I was just another lonely professional looking for connection in a disconnected world. I'd swiped right on hundreds of profiles over the years, had dozens of conversations that led nowhere. What made this one different? Unless it wasn't about me at all. Unless Marcus, or the thing wearing his face, was something that existed in the spaces between digital interactions, feeding on the loneliness and vulnerability that dating apps both promised to fix and perpetuated. I thought about all the people I'd matched with over the years, all the conversations that had started with hope and ended in disappointment. What if some of those profiles weren't people at all? What if they were masks worn by something else? Something that needed human connection for reasons I couldn't understand. The smell was overwhelming now, making my eyes water and my throat burn. I stumbled toward the bathroom, splashing cold water on my face, trying to wash away the fever that seemed to be burning me from the inside out. When I looked in the mirror, my reflection looked wrong. My skin was pale and waxy, my eyes sunken and rimmed with dark circles. But more disturbing was the way the mirror seemed to show more than just my face. Behind my reflection, barely visible in the glass, was the shadow of someone else. Someone standing just out of sight, watching. I spun around, but the bathroom was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, only my own frightened face stared back. The phone buzzed from the bedroom, and I knew without looking that there would be another message. Another step in whatever ritual or process was unfolding around me. I wanted to ignore it, to throw the phone out the window and pretend none of this was happening. But I also knew that wouldn't stop anything. Whatever had started 3 days ago when I'd first swiped right on Marcus's profile was reaching its conclusion whether I participated or not. The message read, "It's time to complete the connection." And below it, something that made my blood freeze. "Open the door." I stood in the bathroom doorway, staring at my phone, as 3 soft knocks echoed through the hotel room. They came from the door to the hallway, precise and rhythmic, like a heartbeat made audible. Every rational part of my mind screamed at me to call hotel security, to dial 911, to do anything except what the message was asking. But there was something else, something deeper and more primal, that whispered compliance might be the only way to make this stop. I approached the door on unsteady legs, my hand hovering over the deadbolt. The knocking came again, patient and insistent. Through the peephole, I could see the hallway, empty except for the usual hotel carpet and artwork. No one was there. But the knocking continued, and with each tap, the sulfur smell grew stronger, the fever more intense. It was as if the sound itself was a physical force, pressing against my skull and demanding entry. I realized with growing horror that I was going to open the door. Not because I wanted to, but because something deeper than want was compelling me. The app had been more than just a dating platform. It had been a doorway, an invitation that I'd accepted without understanding what I was agreeing to. My hand moved toward the lock, guided by a will that was no longer entirely my own. The fever was burning through my brain now, making the edges of my vision swim with shadows that moved independently of any light source. As my fingers touched the cold metal of the deadbolt, the phone buzzed one final time. The message was different from the others, not text, but an image, a photo of me, taken from inside the room, showing me standing at the door with my hand on the lock. But in the reflection of the door's surface, barely visible in the polished metal, was Marcus's face. Not behind me, but somehow occupying the same space, as if we were becoming one entity. The photograph was dated 3 days in the future. I yanked my hand back from the lock, but the damage was already done. The connection had been established the moment I'd first responded to his message, and every interaction since had only strengthened the bond. The app hadn't been showing me potential matches. It had been showing me potential vessels, people whose digital loneliness made them vulnerable to something that existed in the spaces between human connection. The knocking stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. It was the quiet of something waiting, of a predator that knew its prey had nowhere left to run. I looked at my phone one last time, hoping for some sign that this was all an elaborate hoax or technical glitch. But the screen was black now, completely unresponsive. The app had served its purpose. In the mirror across the room, I could see my reflection changing. My features were becoming sharper, more angular, while my eyes took on a yellow cast that reminded me of sulfur flames. The fever was no longer burning. It was transforming, reshaping me into something that could exist in both the physical and digital worlds. I understood now why Marcus had been so insistent on meeting. He hadn't wanted to see me. He'd wanted to become me, to use my body as a new host while my consciousness was absorbed into the app's endless catalog of profiles. Tomorrow, some other lonely traveler would swipe right on my picture, and the cycle would continue. The door to the hallway stood before me, still locked, still safe. But I knew it was only a matter of time before I opened it myself. The thing that had been Marcus was patient, and I was already more it than me. My phone screen flickered back to life, showing a new profile being created. My face smiled back at me from the photo, but the eyes were wrong, ancient and hungry. The bio was already writing itself. E.T. professional visiting Boston, looking for genuine connection. In the distance, I could hear the sound of other phones chiming, other notifications being sent. The app was spreading, reaching out to new victims who would never suspect that their perfect match was something that had never been human at all. I walked toward the door, my movements no longer entirely my own. The lock turned easily under my fingers, and as the door swung open, I wondered if anyone would notice when I didn't check out tomorrow, or if they'd assume I'd simply extended my stay, maybe met someone special during my vacation. The hallway was empty, but I could feel the presence of others like me, scattered throughout the hotel, throughout the city. All of us connected by the same dark app. All of us serving the same ancient hunger that had learned to dress itself in the language of modern loneliness. I stepped into the corridor, and the door closed behind me with a soft click. Somewhere in the distance, another phone chimed with a new match notification, and I smiled with teeth that weren't quite my own anymore. Story 5. The real estate agent had called it a charming Victorian with character. But standing in the master bedroom of my new home on the outskirts of Portland, Maine, I couldn't shake the feeling that the character she'd mentioned was still residing somewhere within these walls. I'd purchased the house sight unseen, a decision my colleagues at the university had called reckless, but one that felt necessary after the divorce. Teaching medieval history for 15 years had taught me that sometimes the past clings to places like barnacles to a ship's hull, and this house, built in 1887, seemed particularly encrusted with decades of accumulated living. The discovery came during my third week of residence, while I was measuring the master bedroom for new furniture. My tape measure struck something hollow in what should have been a solid wall. Running my fingers along the crown molding, I found a section that gave way with surprising ease, revealing a narrow corridor barely wide enough for a man to walk through sideways. The space stretched into darkness, connecting the bedroom to what must have been the attic above. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and the air tasted of old wood and something else. Something metallic and stale that made my throat constrict. The corridor had been sealed deliberately, with fresh plaster and paint that didn't match the rest of the room. That first night, I left the hidden passage open, fascinated by its existence. Why would someone wall up a perfectly functional corridor? The previous owner, according to the paperwork, had been an elderly woman who'd lived alone for the last 20 years of her life. Perhaps she'd grown afraid of the dark spaces in her home, or maybe she'd simply wanted to forget they existed. I learned the answer to that question at exactly 3:17 a.m. The sound came from within the walls themselves. 2 deliberate knocks, measured and purposeful, not the random creaking of settling wood or the scurrying of rodents, but the unmistakable sound of knuckles against wood. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs, and lay perfectly still in the darkness. The knocks repeated. 2, again, with the same rhythm, the same force. They seemed to come from the direction of the hidden corridor, though in my half-awake state, I couldn't be certain. I fumbled for my phone, its screen blazing painfully bright in the darkness. 3:17 a.m. The knocking stopped. Sleep eluded me for the remainder of the night. I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps the house settling in the October cold. Old houses made sounds. It was perfectly normal, but the next night at precisely 3:17 a.m., the knocking returned. This time I was ready. I'd positioned myself in the reading chair beside the bed, facing the wall where the corridor began. The knocks came again, 2 of them, deliberate and patient. But now I could see something that made my blood freeze in my veins. A shadow moved along the wall, tall and distinctly human in shape. It paused at the point where the corridor met the bedroom, and I watched as what appeared to be a hand rose and fell twice against the invisible barrier. The shadow of a man, knocking on a door that didn't exist. I blinked hard, rubbed my eyes, looked again. The shadow was gone, but the knocking continued, 2 more times, before silence returned. My rational mind, the same mind that had earned me a PhD in medieval history, began cataloging explanations. Light from passing cars could create moving shadows. The wind outside could cause tree branches to cast shapes on the wall. The knocking could be pipes expanding and contracting, or perhaps an animal in the attic above. But animals didn't knock in measured pairs, and the shadow had been too precise, too purposeful to be cast by branches. The third night, I made a decision that would prove to be either brilliant or catastrophic. I would seal the corridor again, blocking whatever was causing the disturbance. If it was truly supernatural, perhaps a physical barrier would stop it. If it was psychological, If I was somehow creating these manifestations through stress and adjustment to a new home, then removing the visual reminder might help. I spent the following day at the hardware store, purchasing plaster, paint, and a small interior door. If I was going to block the corridor, I might as well do it properly. I worked through the afternoon, installing the door at the bedroom end of the passage and painting it to match the wall. By evening, no trace of the corridor remained visible. That night, I slept soundly until 3:17 a.m. when the knocking began again. But this time, the sound came from above me, from the ceiling, from the attic itself. 2 measured knocks, directly over my bed. I stared up at the dark ceiling, my skin crawling with the certainty that something was up there, something that had found another way to announce its presence. The pattern became clear over the following nights. When I locked the door I'd installed, sealing the corridor completely, the knocking came from the attic. When I unlocked it, leaving the passage accessible, the knocking returned to the wall, to the shadow hand striking the door. It was as if whatever presence inhabited the house was testing the boundaries I'd created, finding new ways to make itself known. The locked door didn't stop it. It simply redirected it. My sleep became fragmented, broken by the nightly ritual that had become as predictable as sunrise. I would lie awake from 3:00 a.m. onward, waiting for the knocking to begin, my muscles tensed for the inevitable sound. During the day, I found myself constantly glancing at the painted-over door, wondering what might be waiting on the other side. It was during one of these restless afternoons that I decided to explore the attic itself. If the knocking was coming from above when the door was locked, perhaps I could find some clue to its origin up there. The attic access was in the hallway, a narrow pull-down ladder that groaned under my weight. The space above was larger than I'd expected, with slanted ceilings and dormer windows that let in thin streams of autumn light. Dust covered everything in a thick layer, and the air held the same metallic staleness I'd noticed in the corridor. I moved carefully across the creaking floorboards, my flashlight beam sweeping across forgotten furniture and cardboard boxes. Near the center of the attic, directly above where my bed would be, I found something that made my breath catch. A circle of floorboards, roughly 3 feet in diameter, had been stained dark with what looked like old water damage. But as I knelt to examine it more closely, I realized the staining was too uniform, too perfectly circular. And in the center of the circle, as if it had been dropped and forgotten, lay a tarnished silver pocket watch. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The watch was old, its case engraved with initials I couldn't quite make out in the dim light. The face was cracked, spiderwebbed with fractures that radiated out from the center. But it was the position of the hands that made my heart skip. 3:17. The watch had stopped at exactly 3:17. I wound it carefully, listening to the mechanism tick back to life. But when I checked the time against my phone, the watch was running fast, exactly 7 minutes fast. When I held it to my ear, the ticking sounded irregular, as if it were struggling to keep its rhythm. That night, I kept the watch on my nightstand, its face glowing faintly in the darkness. I'd unlocked the door to the corridor, and at 3:17 a.m., the knocking began again from the wall. 2 measured knocks, followed by the shadow moving along the painted surface. But this time, I noticed something new. The watch on my nightstand was ticking in perfect synchronization with the knocking. Tick-tick, knock-knock, tick-tick, knock-knock. As if the watch and the shadow were connected, 2 parts of the same mechanism. I reached for the watch, and the moment my fingers touched its surface, the knocking stopped. The shadow froze mid-motion, its hand still raised to strike the wall. For a long moment we faced each other across the darkness, me holding the watch, the shadow suspended in its eternal knocking. Then slowly, the shadow turned. Where a face should have been, there was only deeper darkness, but I felt its attention focus on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was looking at the watch in my hands, and I understood with crystalline clarity that it wanted it back. I held the watch tighter, my knuckles white around its case. "What do you want?" I whispered into the darkness. The shadow raised its other hand, pointing not at me, but at the painted door. It wanted me to open the corridor, to let it pass through. But pass through to where? What lay at the other end of that narrow space? Over the following days, I found myself drawn obsessively to research the house's history. I spent hours in the Portland Public Library, combing through old newspaper archives and city records. The house had been built by a wealthy merchant named Thomas Whitmore, who'd lived there until his death in 1923. The circumstances of his death were peculiar. He'd been found in his bedroom, apparently having suffered a heart attack. But the room had been locked from the inside, and the key was never found. The house had changed hands several times over the decades, but I noticed a pattern in the records. No owner had lived there for more than a few years, and several had reported strange occurrences, sounds in the walls, cold spots, and the persistent feeling of being watched. Most intriguingly, I found a police report from 1987. The then current owner had called the police, claiming that someone was in her walls, knocking and trying to get into her bedroom. The officers had found no evidence of an intruder, but they'd noted that the woman appeared genuinely terrified. She'd moved out the following month. As I read these accounts, the watch ticked steadily in my pocket. I'd begun carrying it everywhere, unable to shake the feeling that it was somehow important, that it held the key to understanding what was happening in my house. The shadows in the library seemed to move differently as I read, stretching and contracting as if alive. Other patrons gave me a wide berth, and I caught glimpses of myself in the reflective surfaces around me, hollow-eyed, unshaven, with the watch clutched in my white-knuckled fist. That night I made my decision. I would unlock the door and explore the corridor fully. If Thomas Whitmore had hidden something in that narrow space, if the shadow wanted to show me something, then I would face it directly. I unlocked the door just before 3:17 a.m. and waited. The knocking came, as it always did, but this time I stood and approached the wall. The shadow appeared, its hand raised to knock, and I placed my palm against the painted surface where its face would be. The wall was ice cold, so cold that my hand burned with the contact. But I felt something else, a vibration, as if something was moving on the other side. The shadow's hand dropped, and it stepped back, gesturing for me to follow. I picked up my flashlight and stepped through the doorway into the corridor. The space was even narrower than I'd remembered, forcing me to turn sideways to navigate. The walls pressed in on either side, and the air grew thicker with each step. My flashlight beam trembled in my shaking hand, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance just beyond the reach of the light. Halfway through the corridor, I found what I'd been looking for, or what had been looking for me. A section of the wall had been carved away, creating a small alcove. Inside, partially mummified by the dry air, sat the remains of a man. He was dressed in a suit that might have been fashionable in the 1920s, and his skeletal hands were folded in his lap, clutching something against his chest. Another pocket watch, identical to the one in my pocket. I understood then, with a clarity that cut through my growing madness like a blade. Thomas Whitmore hadn't died of a heart attack in his bedroom. He'd died here, in this hidden corridor, trapped between worlds, and somehow, the watch, his watch, had found its way to the attic above, waiting for someone to wind it again, to restart the mechanism that kept him tethered to this space. The shadow stood beside me now, no longer knocking, no longer trying to get my attention. It simply waited, patient as death itself, for me to understand what needed to be done. I pulled the watch from my pocket and held it beside the one clutched in the dead man's hands. They were identical, down to the smallest detail. But as I watched, the hands on my watch began to move backward, unwinding themselves toward midnight. The shadow nodded, a gesture so human it made my chest ache. It pointed to the dead man's lap, then to the watch in my hand. It wanted me to return what I'd taken, to restore the balance that had been disrupted. But as I reached toward the skeletal hands, a terrible thought struck me. If I gave back the watch, if I restored the natural order, what would happen to me? I was the one who'd found it, who'd wound it, who'd become entangled in its mechanism. Had I simply replaced one trapped soul with another? The shadow's gesture became more insistent, more desperate. The corridor around us began to shift and bend, the walls closing in. I could feel the weight of the house above, the pressure of all those years of accumulated time pressing down on this hidden space. I placed the watch in the dead man's hands, and the world went dark. When I woke, I was lying on the floor of my bedroom, the painted door sealed and perfect beside me. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and I could hear the sounds of morning traffic on the distant road. The watch was gone from my pocket, and the corridor, when I felt along the wall, was solid and unbroken. But every night at 3:17 a.m., I wake to the sound of knocking. 2 measured knocks, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. I lie perfectly still, my heart hammering, and wait for them to stop. Sometimes, in the moments between sleeping and waking, I wonder if I actually returned the watch at all, or if I simply dreamed the whole thing, my mind creating elaborate explanations for the stress of divorce, the isolation of a new home, the weight of too many years spent studying the dead. But then I remember the cold touch of the wall, the sight of those skeletal hands, and I know that some questions are better left unanswered. Some doors are meant to stay locked, some corridors are meant to remain hidden, and some watches are meant to stay stopped at 3:17 a.m. The knocking continues, night after night, a reminder that the past never truly dies. It simply waits, patient as shadows, for someone to wind the mechanism and set time in motion once again. And I lie here in the darkness, wondering if I've solved the mystery of Thomas Whitmore, or if I've simply become the next chapter in a story that has no ending. Only the eternal repetition of 2 knocks in the night, and the shadow of a man who refuses to rest. Story 6. The rental photos hadn't prepared me for how the cabin would feel at dusk, like something alive, breathing in the shadows between the pine trees. I stood on the wraparound porch, watching the last traces of October sunlight bleed through the canopy, and wondered if bringing Mom here for her 70th birthday had been a mistake. The drive up from Manhattan had taken 3 hours, winding through increasingly remote stretches of Long Island until we'd reached this pocket of wilderness that felt forgotten by civilization. Sarah, my wife, had found the place on one of those vacation rental sites, a 1920s hunting lodge converted into a family retreat, complete with stone fireplaces and enough bedrooms to accommodate our small party. Mom had been delighted by the old world charm, the way the floorboards creaked with history, the musty scent of decades-old wood polish. Now, as evening settled over the forest like a heavy blanket, I felt less certain about the choice. The sound of gravel crunching under footsteps drew my attention to the dirt road that curved past our property. A man emerged from the tree line, tall, weathered, wearing a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. He moved with the careful gait of someone who'd spent his life navigating uneven terrain. He introduced himself as Frank, our nearest neighbor, living in a trailer about a quarter mile through the woods. His handshake was firm, calloused, and his eyes held the kind of wariness I'd seen in people who'd lived too long in isolated places. "Beautiful evening," I offered, trying to bridge the awkward silence. Frank nodded, but his gaze kept drifting to the forest behind me. "Yeah, it is. Listen, I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to give you folks a heads up about something." He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "This area's got some peculiarities. Local rule is, after sundown, you don't whistle. Not outside anyway." I felt a smile tugging at my lips. "Whistle? What happens if we whistle?" "Just don't." Frank's expression remained serious. "Been living here 15 years, and I've learned there are things in these woods that respond to certain sounds. Whistling after dark is one of them." The rational part of my mind, the part that had spent 20 years designing skyscrapers and solving structural problems, wanted to dismiss this as backwood superstition. But something in Frank's tone made me hesitate. "What kind of response?" I asked. "The kind you don't want to find out about." He glanced toward the cabin, where warm yellow light spilled from the windows. "You've got family in there. Just trust me on this one." Frank disappeared back into the trees as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving me alone with the gathering darkness and a growing sense of unease that I couldn't quite shake. Inside, the cabin felt warmer, safer. Mom was settled in her favorite armchair near the fireplace, reading a mystery novel she'd brought from home. Sarah was in the kitchen, putting the finishing touches on Mom's birthday dinner, pot roast with all the fixings, exactly the way she'd made it for me when I was growing up. I tried to focus on the domestic comfort of the scene, but Frank's warning kept echoing in my mind. The rational explanation was obvious, probably some kind of local wildlife that responded to high-pitched sounds. Owls, maybe, or coyotes. Nothing to warrant the almost fearful tone in the old man's voice. After dinner, we settled into the living room with wine and birthday cake. Mom regaled us with stories from her childhood, the kind of rambling anecdotes that had seemed tedious when I was younger, but now felt precious. Sarah curled up beside me on the couch, her hand resting on my thigh, and for a moment, the earlier unease faded. It was nearly 11 when Mom announced she was ready for bed. Sarah helped her up the narrow staircase to the second floor, and I remained in the living room, adding another log to the fire and finishing my wine. The cabin had settled into that particular quiet that comes with old houses, the subtle creaks and sighs of wooden joints expanding and contracting with temperature changes. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. I found myself thinking about Frank's warning again. The whole thing seemed absurd in the comfort of the well-lit room, but there was something about the man's certainty that bothered me. What could be so dangerous about whistling? Almost without thinking, I pursed my lips and let out a soft experimental whistle. Nothing more than a few notes from a half-remembered song. The silence that followed felt different somehow. Heavier. I strained to listen, but heard only the usual night sounds. Wind in the trees, the settling of the house, the distant hoot of an owl. Then, from somewhere in the forest, came an answering whistle. The melody was the same, the exact same 3 notes I'd just produced, but the tone was different. Hollow, as if it were coming from inside a tunnel or an empty room. I sat up straighter, my heart rate increasing. It could have been an echo, I told myself. Sound could play tricks in a landscape like this, bouncing off trees and rock formations. But the timing was wrong. Too delayed, too deliberate. The second whistle came a moment later, closer this time. Still the same melody, but now it seemed to be coming from directly outside the cabin. I moved to the window, peering through the glass into the darkness beyond the porch light's reach. The forest was a wall of black shapes, impenetrable. But as I watched, I thought I saw something move between the trees, a shadow that was somehow darker than the surrounding darkness. The third whistle made me step back from the window. It was right outside now, maybe 20 feet from where I stood. The melody was perfect, note for note what I'd whistled moments before, but the quality of the sound raised every hair on my arms. Then I heard the footsteps. They were deliberate, measured, crunching through the carpet of fallen leaves that covered the forest floor. But there was something wrong with the rhythm, too slow, too heavy, as if whatever was making them was either very large or having difficulty walking. The footsteps circled the cabin once, twice, always staying just beyond the reach of the porch light. I followed the sound through the living room, moving from window to window, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was out there. Each time the footsteps paused, another whistle would echo from the darkness, always the same 3 notes, always with that hollow, unnatural quality that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than any human throat. By the time the sounds faded back into the forest, I was sweating despite the cool air. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. A hiker who'd gotten lost, maybe, or someone playing an elaborate prank. But the more I thought about it, the less sense any normal explanation made. I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, then sat in the living room with the fire poker across my knees, listening to the night sounds and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced had been perfectly natural. Sleep came fitfully, plagued by dreams of hollow whistles and something moving through the trees, with footsteps that sounded like drum beats. The next morning brought brilliant sunshine and the kind of crisp October air that makes everything seem possible. Over breakfast, Sarah mentioned that she'd heard some kind of bird call during the night. a three-note whistle that had seemed to go on for hours. "Must have been an owl," she said, buttering her toast. "Or maybe a whippoorwill. They can make the strangest sounds." I nodded and said nothing, but I noticed that Mom kept glancing toward the windows as if expecting to see something in the daylight that hadn't been there the night before. We spent the morning exploring the property, walking the trails that wound through the forest. In the bright sunshine, surrounded by the rustle of autumn leaves and the chatter of squirrels, the previous night's event seemed almost dreamlike. But as we walked, I found myself studying the ground, looking for signs of the footsteps I'd heard. The soil was soft from recent rain, and I found plenty of prints. Deer, raccoon, what might have been a fox, but nothing that could account for the heavy, deliberate sounds that had circled the cabin. Frank appeared again as we were heading back for lunch, emerging from the trees with that same silent, careful gait. He nodded to Sarah and Mom, then caught my eye with a questioning look. "Everything go okay last night?" he asked. I felt Sarah's attention sharpen beside me. Why wouldn't it? Frank's eyes never left mine. "Sometimes people don't listen to warnings." "I might have tested your theory," I admitted. The older man's expression darkened. "And?" "I heard something. Probably just an echo." Frank shook his head slowly. "Echoes don't walk around your house for 2 hours." The words hit me like a physical blow. How could he know how long it had lasted? How could he know it had circled the cabin? "How do you—" "I live close enough to hear when people don't follow advice," Frank said quietly. "Close enough to know when something's been stirred up." He looked at Sarah and Mom, then back at me. "It usually takes a night or two to lose interest. Just don't do it again." After he left, Sarah demanded to know what was going on. I told her about the whistling, about the footsteps, trying to keep my voice calm and rational. But even as I spoke, I could hear how it sounded, like the ravings of someone who'd had too much wine and let his imagination run wild. "It was probably just an animal," Sarah said, but her voice lacked conviction. Mom had been quiet during the exchange, but now she spoke up. "I heard it too, the whistling. It didn't sound like any bird I've ever heard." That afternoon, I found myself unable to concentrate on anything. I kept checking the windows, studying the tree line, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The rational part of my mind insisted that there had to be a logical explanation, but every time I tried to construct one, it fell apart under scrutiny. As evening approached, the sense of dread that had been building all day reached a crescendo. I suggested we drive into town for dinner, maybe catch a movie, anything to avoid spending another night in the cabin. But Mom was tired from the morning's walk, and Sarah had already started preparing dinner. "Besides," Sarah said, "you can't let some old man's ghost stories scare you away from a perfectly nice vacation." But as the sun set and the first shadows began to stretch across the forest floor, I found myself standing at the window again, watching the darkness gather between the trees. This time, I didn't whistle. The first call came at 11:47 p.m. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside me, when I heard it. That same hollow three-note whistle floating through the forest. But this time, I hadn't initiated it. This time, whatever was out there was calling on its own. I slipped out of bed and moved to the window. The forest was a solid wall of darkness, but I could hear the footsteps beginning their circuit around the cabin. Slow, deliberate, patient. The whistle came again, and this time I thought I heard something else beneath it. A quality that was almost like speech, like words being formed by something that didn't quite understand how human voices worked. I checked on Mom in the next room. She was sitting up in bed, her face pale in the moonlight streaming through her window. "You hear it too?" she whispered. I nodded and sat on the edge of her bed. "It's probably just... don't." Her voice was sharp. "Don't try to explain it away. I've lived for 70 years and I've never heard anything like that." The whistling continued for 3 hours, circling the cabin in a pattern that seemed almost ritualistic. Sometimes it would pause, and in the silence, I could hear other sounds. Branches snapping, leaves rustling, and underneath it all, a sound like breathing that was too deep, too slow to be human. By the time it finally faded back into the forest, all three of us were awake, huddled in the living room with every light in the cabin blazing. "We should leave," Sarah said, "first thing in the morning." I nodded, but as I looked out the window at the pre-dawn darkness, I wondered if whatever was out there would simply follow us. The thought came unbidden, irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we had somehow broken a rule, crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. Frank appeared at sunrise looking haggard and older than he had the day before. "It's getting stronger," he said without preamble. "You need to leave. Today." "What is it?" I asked. "What's out there?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into the forest. "I don't know. I've never seen it, never want to. But it's been here longer than the trees, longer than anything. And it's patient. It'll wait as long as it takes." "For what?" "For someone to answer back." The words sent a chill down my spine. "Answer back?" "That's what it wants. It calls, and it waits for someone to call back. Most people are smart enough not to. But sometimes..." He shrugged. "Sometimes people get curious. Sometimes they think they're brave." I packed the car while Sarah and Mom gathered their things. As we loaded the last of the luggage, I found myself looking back at the cabin, at the forest that surrounded it. In the morning light, it looked peaceful, almost inviting. But as we drove away, I caught a glimpse of something in the rearview mirror. A shadow moving between the trees, too tall and too angular to be human, watching us leave. The drive back to Manhattan was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts. We made good time, reaching the city by early afternoon. As we pulled into our driveway, surrounded by the familiar sounds of traffic and urban life, the events of the past 2 days began to feel like a strange dream. That night, safe in our own bed, I tried to convince myself that it had all been some kind of shared delusion, a product of isolation and suggestion. But as I drifted off to sleep, I found myself listening for a sound that didn't belong, a hollow whistle carried on the wind. I woke at 3 a.m. to Sarah shaking my shoulder. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. I listened, and there it was, faint but unmistakable, drifting through our bedroom window from the street below. 3 notes, hollow and patient, the same melody I'd whistled in the cabin 3 days ago. I got up and looked out the window. The street was empty, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights. But as I watched, I saw a shadow move between the parked cars, too tall and too angular to be human. The whistling came again, closer now, and I realized with a growing sense of horror that Frank had been wrong about one thing. It hadn't lost interest. It had simply followed us home. As I write this, it's been 2 weeks since we returned from Long Island. The whistling comes every night now, always at the same time, always the same 3 notes. Sometimes I see the shadow in the street, sometimes in the alley behind our building, sometimes pressed against the windows of neighboring apartments. It's patient. It can wait as long as it takes. And God help me, I'm starting to understand what it wants. It wants me to whistle back. The urge grows stronger every night. Sometimes I catch myself pursing my lips, forming the notes almost unconsciously. Sarah has noticed. She watches me constantly now, her eyes full of worry and something that might be fear. I've tried to research the area where the cabin was located, looking for historical records, folklore, anything that might explain what we encountered. But the internet is full of ghost stories and urban legends, and I can't tell anymore what's real and what's imagination. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the uncertainty is part of it, the way it wears you down until you can't trust your own perceptions anymore. I've started taking sleeping pills, hoping to avoid the nightly visits. But even in my drugged sleep, I can hear it calling, and I dream of walking through a forest where the trees have eyes, and the shadows whisper secrets in a language I almost understand. Last night, I found myself standing at the window with my lips pursed, ready to answer the call. Only Sarah's hand on my shoulder stopped me. "Don't," she whispered. "Please don't." But I'm not sure how much longer I can resist. The melody is so simple, so familiar now. Just 3 notes. What harm could 3 notes do? I think I'm starting to understand why Frank looked so tired, so worn down. I think he's been fighting this same battle for 15 years, listening to the calls and trying not to answer. The question is, what happens when you finally give in? I'm afraid I'm about to find out. Because tonight, for the first time since we returned, I heard something new in the whistling, a note of impatience, of demand. It's tired of waiting. It's tired of being ignored. And as I sit here writing this, I can feel the urge building again, stronger than ever before. My lips are moving, forming the shape of those 3 notes, and I'm not sure I can stop myself this time. The sound is coming from right outside my window now, close enough that I can hear the breathing underneath it, slow and deep and utterly inhuman. It's calling to me, and I think I'm finally ready to answer. Story 7. The fluorescent lights in the Sunset Manor nursing home hummed with that particular frequency that made my teeth ache. 3 weeks into my psychology internship, and I'd already learned to associate that sound with the slow dissolution of human dignity. But nothing prepared me for room 237, where Harold Whitman spent his afternoons chatting with empty air. The first time I witnessed it, I assumed it was standard dementia-related hallucination. Harold sat in his threadbare armchair, facing the corner where afternoon sunlight struggled through grimy windows. His weathered hands gestured animatedly as he spoke to someone who wasn't there. "Tommy's been telling me about his travels," Harold explained when I approached with his afternoon medication. His roomy eyes sparkled with genuine delight. "He's been to places I've only dreamed of seeing." I nodded politely, making mental notes about visual hallucinations and social interaction patterns, standard textbook material. But something about Harold's certainty unsettled me. His conversations weren't the rambling, disconnected monologues typical of dementia patients. They had rhythm, pause, response, as if he were actually listening to someone. The head nurse, Mrs. Patterson, had worked at Sunset Manor for 30 years. Her no-nonsense demeanor cracked slightly when I asked about Harold's invisible companion. "That boy's been visiting Harold for about 6 months now," she said, lowering her voice as we stood in the hallway. "Always around 3:30 in the afternoon. Harold calls him Tommy, says he's about 12 years old. The thing is," she paused, glancing toward room 237. "Harold's never mentioned having grandchildren. No family at all, actually." I spent the following week observing Harold's routine. Every day at precisely 3:30 p.m., he would position himself in the corner chair and begin his animated conversations. His side of the dialogue revealed fragments of a relationship with someone young, adventurous, and apparently very real to Harold. The old man would chuckle at unheard jokes, nod thoughtfully at unheard observations, and occasionally look concerned about unheard troubles. What troubled me most wasn't Harold's certainty. It was the effect his invisible friend had on other residents. Mrs. Chen, whose room was adjacent to Harold's, complained about hearing children's laughter in the afternoons. She insisted someone was running up and down the hallway, though the staff never saw anyone. Mr. Rodriguez, despite his advanced Alzheimer's, would become agitated every afternoon, claiming a little person was watching him through his doorway. The rational part of my mind cataloged these incidents as mass suggestion, environmental factors, or medication side effects. But the oppressive atmosphere that settled over the second floor each afternoon felt too tangible, too focused, to dismiss entirely. By the third week, I noticed something else. Harold's door would be closed when I arrived for evening rounds, despite him never closing it during the day. When I knocked, there would be a long pause before Harold's voice, sounding strained and breathless, would tell me to wait. Then I'd hear what sounded like a chair scraping against the floor, followed by slow footsteps. When Harold finally opened the door, he appeared flushed and slightly out of breath. "Just finishing up my visit with Tommy," he'd explain, but his eyes would dart nervously around the room as if checking to ensure he was alone. The infrared camera was my supervisor's suggestion. Dr. Martinez thought documenting Harold's behavior patterns might help us develop better therapeutic interventions. She approved the temporary installation of a small security camera in the hallway outside room 237, equipped with motion sensors and night vision capabilities. I set up the monitoring station in the unused office down the hall, telling myself I was conducting legitimate research. The camera had a perfect view of Harold's doorway and the adjacent hallway. All I had to do was wait for 3:30 p.m. The first day's footage showed Harold leaving his room at 3:28 p.m., walking to the vending machine, and returning at 3:32 p.m. Nothing unusual. But as I watched Harold enter his room, something made me rewind the footage. There, in the grainy infrared image, was a brief distortion near Harold's feet, a small dark shape that seemed to move independently before disappearing into the room. I stared at the screen until my eyes burned. The shape was too small to be a person, too mobile to be a shadow. It moved with purpose, keeping pace with Harold's shuffling gait. When I enhanced the image, the distortion became more pronounced, revealing what appeared to be a diminutive figure walking alongside the old man. The footage from the second day was more disturbing. Harold entered his room at the usual time, but the infrared camera captured movement in the hallway for another 10 minutes. The small figure appeared to be playing some kind of game, darting between doorways, hiding behind the nurse's station, and at one point, standing directly in front of Mr. Rodriguez's room. The timestamp showed 3:45 p.m., exactly when Mr. Rodriguez had his daily episode of agitation. But it was the third day's footage that made my hands shake as I watched. Harold had been in his room for 20 minutes when the small figure appeared in the hallway, moving toward his door. I watched, transfixed, as the dark shape approached the door handle. The infrared camera clearly showed the handle moving downward, turning with deliberate pressure. The door swung open, and the figure disappeared inside. This was impossible. Harold's door had been closed, and there was no one in the hallway. Yet the camera showed the door handle moving with the kind of precise motion that only comes from an intelligent grip. I sat in the monitoring room until nearly midnight, replaying the footage frame by frame. The small figure appeared consistently, always moving with purpose, always interacting with the environment in ways that suggested physical presence. But what kind of presence could be captured by infrared sensors yet remain invisible to the human eye? The next afternoon, I positioned myself in the hallway outside room 237 at 3:25 p.m. Harold was already in his chair facing the corner. The corridor was empty except for the usual institutional sounds, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant murmur of the television in the common room, the occasional shuffle of feet from other residents. At exactly 3:30 p.m., Harold began speaking. His voice carried the warm, patient tone of someone addressing a child. From my position in the hallway, I could hear fragments of his conversation. "Tell me about the ocean, Tommy. What did the waves sound like?" A pause, as if Harold were listening intently. "That sounds beautiful. I've always wanted to see the Pacific." Another pause, longer this time. "You're right. It is getting late. Will you be back tomorrow?" The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, following the same pattern of Harold speaking, listening, and responding. But as I strained to hear any other voice, any sound that might explain his responses, I became aware of something else. The temperature in the hallway had dropped noticeably. My breath began to form small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. The cold seemed to emanate from Harold's room, creeping along the floor like fog. Other residents' doors began to close as the chill spread. Mrs. Chen's door clicked shut first, followed by Mr. Rodriguez's, then Mrs. Thompson's. One by one, the second-floor residents sealed themselves away from whatever was happening in room 237. At 3:45 p.m., Harold's voice changed. The warm, grandfatherly tone became strained, almost fearful. "Tommy, I think you should go now. The nurse will be making rounds soon." Silence. "Please, Tommy. You know what happened last time someone saw you." The fear in Harold's voice was unmistakable. This wasn't the confusion of dementia or the placid acceptance of hallucination. This was genuine terror. I moved closer to the door, my heart hammering against my ribs. Through the gap at the bottom, I could see Harold's feet shuffling nervously in his chair. Then I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. A sound like fingernails scratching against wood, coming from inside the room. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. Harold's voice became pleading. Tommy, please. Not again. I can't explain it if they find marks on the walls. The scratching stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, I heard Harold's labored breathing and the creak of his chair as he shifted nervously. Then, clear as day, I heard the distinct sound of small footsteps moving across the room, footsteps that belonged to no one I could see. I reached for the door handle, my hand trembling. The metal was ice cold, so cold it burned my palm. As I turned the handle, it moved smoothly for a moment, then stopped. I pushed harder, but the door wouldn't budge. It wasn't locked. The handle turned freely, but something was preventing it from opening. From inside the room, I heard Harold's voice, high and frightened. "He's trying to come in, Tommy. Make him go away." The handle jerked in my grip, as if someone on the other side were pulling it upward while I pushed down. The struggle lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, suddenly, the resistance vanished. The door swung open so quickly I stumbled into the room. Harold sat in his chair, pale and shaking. The room was empty except for the two of us, but the temperature was arctic. My breath came in visible puffs as I looked around the seemingly vacant space. "Harold, are you all right?" The old man's eyes were wide with fear, but not fear of me. He was looking at something behind me, something near the door. "He's still here," Harold whispered. "Tommy doesn't like strangers." I turned around, seeing nothing but empty air, but the cold intensified, and I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as something brushed against my leg, something small and quick, like a child ducking past. I spun around, but there was nothing there. Nothing but Harold, sitting in his chair, and the overwhelming presence of something else in the room. "I think you should leave now," Harold said quietly. "Tommy gets upset when people stay too long." I wanted to argue, to insist on rational explanations, to demand answers. But as I stood in that freezing room, feeling invisible eyes studying me, rational thought abandoned me. I backed toward the door, my gaze darting around the empty space, searching for movement that logic insisted couldn't exist. As I reached the threshold, I heard Harold's voice, soft and apologetic. "I'm sorry, Tommy. I know you don't like him." The door slammed shut behind me with enough force to rattle the frame. I stood in the hallway, breathing hard, trying to process what had just happened. The temperature gradually returned to normal, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I returned to the monitoring station and reviewed the footage of my encounter. The infrared camera showed me approaching Harold's door, struggling with the handle, and entering the room. It showed Harold in his chair, apparently alone. But there, captured in the thermal imaging, was the unmistakable outline of a small figure standing near the door. A figure that moved away as I entered, then positioned itself between Harold and me. The figure was child-sized, but its proportions were wrong. Too thin, too angular, with limbs that bent in ways that hurt to contemplate. When I enhanced the image, trying to make out features, the figure seemed to shift and blur, as if it were somehow aware of being observed. I spent the rest of the night staring at that footage, trying to find a rational explanation. Equipment malfunction, environmental factors, psychological suggestion, anything that would restore my grip on reality. But the evidence was undeniable. Something was visiting Harold, something that could manipulate physical objects and register on infrared sensors while remaining invisible to human sight. The next morning, I found Harold in the common room, looking haggard and exhausted. When I approached, he glanced around nervously before speaking. "Tommy was angry last night," he said quietly. "He doesn't understand why people want to watch him." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the building's air conditioning. "Harold, who is Tommy? Really?" The old man's eyes filled with tears. "I don't know anymore. He showed up 6 months ago, just after I started forgetting things. He said he was lonely, that he needed a friend. I thought..." Harold's voice broke. "I thought he was just my mind playing tricks, but he knows things I never told anyone. And he's getting stronger." "What do you mean, stronger?" Harold glanced around the common room, ensuring we were alone. At first, he could only talk to me. Then he started moving things, small things like pencils or papers. Last week he opened my window. Yesterday he... Harold paused, his face pale. Yesterday he touched Mrs. Chen. She screamed and wouldn't tell anyone why. The implications of Harold's words settled over me like a shroud. If Tommy was gaining physical strength, if he was beginning to interact with other residents, then whatever was happening in room 237 was escalating beyond a simple case of dementia-related hallucination. I returned to my supervisor with a carefully worded report, focusing on Harold's behavioral patterns and the need for increased observation. I didn't mention the infrared footage or my own experience with the locked door. Dr. Martinez approved continued monitoring, suggesting that Harold's case might provide valuable insights into the psychological mechanisms of persistent hallucinations. But as I prepared for another afternoon of observation, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was no longer studying Harold's delusions. I was documenting the emergence of something that defied every principle of psychology and physics I'd ever learned. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting their harsh glow on the empty hallway. In a few hours, the temperature would drop, doors would close, and Harold would begin his daily conversation with his invisible friend. And somewhere in the space between observation and experience, between science and impossibility, I would continue my vigil, no longer certain whether I was trying to help Harold or trying to understand the nature of the thing that had claimed him. Tommy was getting stronger, and with each passing day, I found myself wondering not whether he was real, but what he wanted, and whether Harold was his only friend, or merely his first. Story 8. The fluorescent lights above my cubicle had been flickering for 3 hours straight, casting intermittent shadows across the quarterly reports spread before me. It was past 11 p.m. on a Thursday, and the 42nd floor of the Millennium Tower had emptied hours ago, leaving only the distant hum of ventilation systems and the occasional ping of the elevator servicing other floors. I should have gone home, should have finished these reconciliations tomorrow, but the month-end deadline loomed like a storm cloud, and my supervisor had made it clear that overtime wasn't optional, it was expected. I rubbed my eyes and reached for my coffee, finding the mug cold and bitter. The city lights below painted geometric patterns across the glass walls of our corner office, Chicago's skyline glittering like scattered diamonds against the velvet darkness of Lake Michigan. Everything seemed normal, mundane even, until I heard it. A voice, distant and melodic, drifted through the silence like smoke through still air. At first I thought it might be coming from the security guard's radio or perhaps a late-night cleaning crew, but as I strained to listen, the sound revealed itself as something far more haunting. It was singing, a woman's voice, rich and sorrowful, carrying notes that seemed to echo from another era entirely. The melody was unfamiliar, yet somehow achingly familiar, like a half-remembered lullaby from childhood. It seemed to be coming from the direction of the executive wing, where CEO Marcus Thornfield kept his corner office. But that was impossible. Thornfield had left for London 3 days ago, and his office remained locked, accessible only to his personal assistant, who had also taken the week off. I stood slowly, my chair creaking in protest, and moved toward the source of the sound. The singing grew clearer as I approached, revealing itself as something operatic, perhaps Italian, though the words remained indistinct. The voice carried an otherworldly quality, as if the singer were performing from the bottom of a well or through layers of glass. The executive hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, its polished marble floors reflecting the emergency lighting that glowed at intervals along the walls. The singing seemed to pulse with the rhythm of my heartbeat, drawing me forward against my better judgment. Each step echoed despite my efforts to move quietly, the sound bouncing off the walls and creating a symphony of footfalls that seemed to harmonize with the distant voice. As I reached the outer door to Thornfield's office suite, I noticed that the security keypad was dark, its usual red light extinguished. The heavy oak door stood slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. The singing had grown more distinct now, and I could make out the emotional peaks and valleys of the melody, the way the voice would rise with passion before falling into melancholy whispers. I pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the soft squeal of hinges that seemed amplified in the silence. The reception area of Thornfield's suite was empty, his assistant's desk cleared of everything except a single potted orchid that drooped as if mourning. The singing was definitely coming from the inner office now, and with it came something else, a subtle change in the air itself, as if the temperature had dropped several degrees. The inner office door was also ajar, and through the gap, I could see the faint outline of Thornfield's massive desk, its surface illuminated by the city lights streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. But as I stepped closer, something impossible presented itself to my eyes. Papers were moving, not falling or scattered by any breeze, but moving with purpose, as if invisible hands were sorting through documents, lifting pages to examine them before setting them down again. Financial reports, contracts, and memoranda danced in the air like autumn leaves caught in a whirlwind. Yet there was no wind. The movements were deliberate, methodical, as if someone were conducting a careful review of the company's most sensitive documents. The singing continued, now seeming to come from directly ahead of me, from the space behind Thornfield's desk where the papers performed their impossible ballet. And then I felt it, a breath of cold air against the back of my neck, as intimate as a lover's whisper, yet carrying with it the chill of winter mornings and forgotten graves. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs, but found nothing behind me except the empty doorway and the dark corridor beyond. When I turned back toward the desk, the papers had settled, lying scattered across the surface as if disturbed by some sudden gust. But the singing continued, and now I could hear something else beneath it, a soft, rhythmic sound like breathing, or perhaps sighing. Each sigh seemed to correspond with the subtle dimming of the office lights, as if the very presence creating these sounds was somehow draining the electrical systems. The fluorescent fixtures above flickered in rhythm with the breathing, creating a strobe effect that made the shadows dance and shift like living things. I should have left then. Every instinct I possessed screamed at me to turn around, walk back to my cubicle, pack my things, and go home. But something kept me rooted to the spot, some combination of curiosity and disbelief that made rational thought impossible. I found myself stepping into the office, my feet carrying me forward despite my mind's protests. The singing grew louder as I approached the desk, and now I could make out individual words, though they were in a language I didn't recognize. The voice seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding me like water, filling my ears with its haunting melody. And then, as I reached for one of the scattered documents, the singing stopped. The silence that followed was more oppressive than the mysterious voice had been. It pressed against my eardrums like a physical weight, broken only by the sound of my own breathing and the distant hum of the building's systems. I picked up the document, a project proposal dated 3 years ago, and began to read. The Meridian Development Project. I had never heard of it, despite my 3 years with the company and my access to most financial records. According to the document, it had been a massive undertaking, a plan to develop a series of luxury residential towers along the lakefront. The projected profits were staggering, the scope ambitious enough to transform the company's entire trajectory. But stamped across the top of the document, in red ink that seemed to glow in the dim light, was a single word: canceled. I gathered more papers, my hand shaking as I sorted through what appeared to be an entire project archive. Environmental impact studies, architectural plans, financial projections, all bearing the same red stamp. The Meridian Development Project had been terminated abruptly, with no explanation given in any of the documents I could find. And then I found the photograph. It was tucked between 2 budget reports, a black and white image that seemed to be from the 1920s or 1930s. The photograph showed a woman in an elegant evening gown, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the era, standing in front of what appeared to be a luxury apartment building. Her face was turned slightly away from the camera, but something about her posture suggested sadness, or perhaps resignation. On the back of the photograph, in faded ink, someone had written, "Elena Meridian, 1931. May her voice never be forgotten." The temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees as I stared at the photograph. The woman's face, though partially obscured, struck me as hauntingly beautiful, and there was something about her that seemed familiar, though I was certain I had never seen her before. That's when the singing began again, but this time, it wasn't coming from some distant corner of the office. It was coming from directly in front of me, from the space just beyond the desk where the photograph had been taken. The voice was clearer now, more present, and I could hear the pain woven through every note. It was a lament, a song of loss and longing that seemed to resonate in my bones. The papers on the desk began to move again, but now they were organizing themselves, forming neat stacks as if guided by invisible hands. The Meridian Project documents separated themselves from the others, arranging themselves in chronological order. And as they moved, the singing grew more intense, more urgent, as if the voice were trying to communicate something vital. I found myself reaching for my phone to call security, but when I looked at the screen, the display showed only static. The numbers were there, but they seemed to shift and blur whenever I tried to focus on them. My hands trembled as I attempted to dial, but no sound came from the device. The singing reached a crescendo, and suddenly every light in the office went out simultaneously. The sudden darkness was complete, absolute, broken only by the distant glow of the city lights through the windows. But even that seemed muted now, as if the very air had thickened around me. In the darkness, I could hear movement. Not the rustling of papers this time, but something else. Footsteps, soft and deliberate, moving around the office. They seemed to circle me, maintaining a constant distance, neither approaching nor retreating. The singing had become a whisper now, words in that unknown language that seemed to flow like water over stones. I fumbled for my phone's flashlight, my fingers clumsy with fear, but when the beam cut through the darkness, it revealed nothing unusual. The office looked exactly as it should, empty, quiet, corporate. The papers were still scattered across the desk, but they were no longer moving. The Meridian Project documents were visible among them, but they seemed like ordinary files now, nothing more than forgotten business proposals. But the singing continued, and now I could understand some of the words. They were in English, though heavily accented, and they spoke of promises broken, of dreams buried beneath concrete and steel, of a voice that would never be silenced. I gathered the Meridian documents and stuffed them into my briefcase, driven by an impulse I couldn't explain. As I did so, the singing began to fade, growing distant again, until it was barely audible above the sound of my own heartbeat. The lights flickered back on, one by one, until the office was once again bathed in the familiar glow of fluorescent bulbs. I left the executive suite quickly, my footsteps echoing down the marble hallway like gunshots. But as I reached the main office area, I realized something that made my blood run cold. The security cameras that monitored the executive wing were dark, their red recording lights extinguished. According to the system display at the security desk, they had been offline for exactly 43 minutes, the same amount of time I had spent investigating the singing. Back at my cubicle, I spread the Meridian documents across my desk and began to read by the light of my desk lamp. The story that emerged was both fascinating and deeply disturbing. The Meridian Development Project had been approved and funded, with construction beginning on the first tower in 1931. The project was spearheaded by Elena Meridian, a wealthy heiress who had inherited her father's construction empire, but according to the documents, the project had been abruptly canceled after Elena's disappearance. She had vanished without a trace from her apartment in the nearly completed first tower, leaving behind only a note expressing her love for the city and her hope that her voice would never be forgotten. The cancellation had been orchestrated by her business partner, Marcus Thornfield Sr., the current CEO's grandfather. The document suggested that Thornfield had been embezzling funds from the project, using Elena's trust fund to finance his own ventures. When Elena began to investigate the discrepancies, she had threatened to expose him. The last document in the file was a memorandum from Thornfield Sr. to his legal team, instructing them to ensure that all records of the Meridian project were sealed and that Elena's name was to be removed from all company documents. The memo concluded with a chilling line: "Her voice has been silenced. Let it remain so." But as I read those words, I heard it again, The singing, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the office like a memory made manifest. This time, however, it seemed to be coming from inside my own head, as if Elena's voice had found a way to reach across the decades and speak directly to me. I looked up from the documents to find that the office had changed. The fluorescent lights were dimmer now, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and twist like living things. The city lights beyond the windows had taken on an amber quality, reminiscent of the lighting in old photographs. And in the reflection of the glass, I could see her. Elena Meridian stood behind me, her figure translucent but unmistakable. She was exactly as she appeared in the photograph, elegant, beautiful, and infinitely sad. Her lips moved as she sang, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, filling the air with its haunting melody. When I turned to face her, she was gone. But the documents on my desk had rearranged themselves once more, and now they formed a clear pattern. The financial records, the construction reports, the legal memoranda. They told the complete story of Elena's murder and the cover-up that had followed. Marcus Thornfield Sr. had indeed been embezzling from the Meridian project, but Elena had discovered more than just financial irregularities. She had uncovered evidence of bribery, fraud, and conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of city government. Her threats to expose the truth had sealed her fate. The documents revealed that Elena had been murdered in her apartment, her body disposed of in the foundation of the very building she had dreamed of creating. The official story of her disappearance had been carefully crafted to avoid suspicion, and the Meridian project had been canceled to prevent any future investigation of the site. But Elena's voice had not been silenced. According to the final document, a journal entry in her own handwriting, she had known what was coming. She had prepared for it, using her knowledge of the occult and her connection to the building itself to ensure that her spirit would remain tied to the company that had betrayed her. "My voice will echo through these halls," she had written, "until justice is served and the truth is revealed. They may bury my body, but they cannot bury my words." As I finished reading, the singing reached a crescendo that seemed to shake the very foundations of the building. The lights flickered wildly, and papers began to swirl around the office like autumn leaves caught in a tornado. But this time I wasn't afraid. I understood now what Elena wanted, what she had been trying to communicate through her midnight performances. She wanted her story told. She wanted the truth to be revealed, no matter how many decades had passed. And she had chosen me as her voice, her instrument of justice in a world that had forgotten her name. The singing began to fade as I gathered the documents into my briefcase. But as the last notes echoed through the office, I heard something else, a whisper, soft and grateful, that seemed to come from the very walls themselves. "Thank you," it said, and I knew that Elena Meridian was finally at peace. But as I prepared to leave, I realized that my work was far from over. The current Marcus Thornfield was the grandson of Elena's murderer, and he had built his empire on the foundation of her grave. The Meridian Project documents were evidence of crimes that had never been prosecuted, injustices that had never been addressed. I looked at my watch and was surprised to find that it was nearly dawn. The Chicago skyline was beginning to glow with the first light of morning, and the city was stirring to life below. But up here, in the executive suite of the Millennium Tower, the past and present had collided in ways that would never be fully understood. As I walked toward the elevator, I could still hear it, faint but persistent, like an echo that would never fully fade. Elena's voice, singing her eternal song of loss and longing, waiting for the day when her story would finally be told, and her murder would be avenged. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and I stepped inside, the Meridian documents clutched tightly in my hands. As the car began its descent toward the lobby, I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the polished metal doors. For just a moment, I could have sworn I saw someone else standing beside me, a woman in an elegant evening gown, her dark hair styled in the fashion of the 1930s, smiling with quiet satisfaction. But when I looked again, there was only my own tired face staring back at me, and the faint echo of singing that might have been nothing more than the wind rushing past the building's facade. The elevator reached the lobby, and the doors opened to reveal the marble atrium bathed in the golden light of morning. I stepped out into the world, carrying with me the weight of Elena's story and the responsibility of her trust. Whether what I had experienced was real or imagined, supernatural or psychological, no longer mattered. What mattered was that Elena Meridian's voice would finally be heard, and that the truth, no matter how long buried, would at last see the light of day. Behind me, as the elevator doors closed and the car began its journey back to the 42nd floor, I could still hear it, faint but eternal, beautiful and terrible, the sound of a voice that would never be silenced. The song of Elena Meridian echoed through the halls of the Millennium Tower, waiting for the next soul brave enough to listen and strong enough to carry her message into the light. Story 9. The notification had pinged at 6:47 p.m., just as I was contemplating another night of instant ramen and dissertation revisions. Jessica, 24, 2 miles away. Her profile showed a smile that seemed genuine, not the practiced Instagram smirk I'd grown accustomed to. When she suggested meeting at the Mockingbird Diner on the outskirts of Nashville, I should have suggested somewhere closer to campus. Should have trusted the gnawing sensation in my stomach that had nothing to do with hunger. But I didn't. The Honda Civic that pulled up to my apartment complex looked newer than mine, cleaner. Jessica behind the wheel looked exactly like her photos, auburn hair catching the last rays of September sunlight, freckles scattered across her nose like constellations I wanted to map with my fingertips. When she offered to drive, citing her familiarity with the area, I accepted without question. The first mistake in what would become a catalog of increasingly poor decisions. The air conditioning hummed steadily as we pulled away from the University District, the familiar sprawl of Nashville's suburbs giving way to something less defined. Jessica's conversation flowed easily. Graduate school stories, shared complaints about professors, the usual dance of two people trying to determine compatibility. Her voice had a musical quality that made me want to lean closer, though something about her laugh seemed to echo longer than it should in the confined space of the car. 20 minutes into the drive, the first uncomfortable silence settled between us. Jessica's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she took an exit I didn't recognize, leading us onto a 2-lane state highway that cut through increasingly dense forest. The trees pressed closer to the road here, their canopy creating a tunnel of shadows that seemed to swallow the car's headlights, despite the fact that sunset was still an hour away. I pulled out my phone to check our location, but the signal bars had vanished entirely. The last tower must have been miles behind us, lost in the suburban maze we'd left behind. Jessica noticed my frown and offered an apologetic smile, explaining that this was a shortcut she'd discovered during her undergrad years, a faster route to the diner that avoided the weekend traffic on the main highways. The road began to curve more sharply, winding through hollows and over ridges that I couldn't remember from any map of Middle Tennessee. Each turn revealed more of the same: dense forest, broken only by the occasional glimpse of a rusted mailbox or the skeletal remains of a barn that time had claimed. The asphalt beneath us grew rougher, patched with irregular strips of newer concrete that created a rhythmic thumping that synced with my heartbeat. Jessica's conversation had become sporadic, punctuated by longer pauses as she navigated the increasingly treacherous curves. Her knuckles showed white against the steering wheel, and I noticed a thin line of perspiration along her hairline despite the cool air flowing from the vents. When I asked how much farther we had to go, she glanced at the dashboard clock and murmured something about time moving differently on back roads. The first real surge of unease came when I tried to access my phone's offline maps. The screen displayed our location as a tangled knot of roads that seemed to fold in on themselves, creating impossible loops that defied basic geography. According to the GPS, we were traveling in a perfect circle, returning to the same coordinates every few minutes despite the fact that the road ahead continued to unfold in straight lines and gentle curves. I showed Jessica the screen, pointing out the anomaly with a nervous laugh. She glanced at it briefly before returning her attention to the road. suggesting that GPS systems often malfunctioned in areas with dense tree cover. Her explanation was logical, even reassuring, but something in her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as me. The sun had begun its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the road like grasping fingers. The forest around us seemed to grow thicker, more oppressive, as if the trees were slowly closing in on the narrow strip of asphalt. Occasionally, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that might have been deer or wild turkey, but which vanished the moment I turned my head to look directly at them. Jessica's conversation had ceased entirely now, her focus entirely consumed by the road ahead. The curves seemed to grow sharper, more frequent, as if we were descending into some vast spiral that would eventually deposit us at the center of the earth. The thumping of the patched asphalt had evolved into a hypnotic rhythm that seemed to emanate from inside my skull rather than from the road surface. I tried to focus on familiar landmarks, a distinctive rock formation, a particular arrangement of trees, anything that might help me orient myself in this maze of country roads. But the landscape seemed to shift and blur, refusing to resolve into anything I could fix in my memory. Every hill looked like the one we'd just crested, every curve identical to the dozen that had preceded it. The silence in the car had become oppressive, broken only by the hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of the road. Jessica's breathing had grown shallow, and I noticed her glancing repeatedly at the rearview mirror, as if she expected to see something following us. When I turned to look through the rear window, I saw only the empty road stretching back into the growing darkness. The dashboard clock read 8:15 p.m. when Jessica finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. She mentioned that the restaurant should be just around the next curve, but her words lacked conviction. The next curve led to another, and then another, each one identical to the last. The forest pressed closer, and I began to notice that the trees seemed wrong somehow. Too uniform, too perfectly spaced, as if they'd been planted rather than grown wild. My phone screen continued to display the same impossible tangle of roads, our location marker blinking steadily at the center of a maze that couldn't exist. The odometer showed that we'd traveled nearly 70 miles since leaving my apartment, but according to the GPS, we hadn't moved at all. The contradiction gnawed at me, creating a cognitive dissonance that made my skin crawl. Jessica's hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel now, and I noticed that her eyes darted constantly between the road ahead and the mirrors, as if she were tracking something I couldn't see. When I asked if she was feeling all right, she nodded quickly, too quickly, and pressed harder on the accelerator. The speedometer climbed past the posted limit, but our progress through the forest seemed unchanged. The same trees, the same curves, the same oppressive canopy blocking out the sky. The temperature inside the car had begun to drop, despite the closed windows and functioning heater. My breath started to fog slightly as I exhaled, and I noticed that Jessica's breathing had become visible as well. She reached for the climate controls, but her movements seemed distant, disconnected, as if she were operating the car from somewhere far away. The road ahead shimmered like heat waves rising from summer asphalt, but the distortion was all wrong for the cooling evening air. The trees beyond the shimmer looked different, older, more gnarled, their branches reaching toward the road like arthritic fingers. Jessica slowed the car, her foot hovering uncertainly above the brake pedal as we approached what looked like a section of road that bent reality around itself. I wanted to tell her to stop, to turn around, to find any way out of this increasingly surreal journey. But my voice seemed trapped in my throat, frozen by the growing certainty that we were no longer traveling through any landscape that appeared on conventional maps. The rational part of my mind insisted that we were simply lost, that the GPS was malfunctioning, that darkness and fatigue were playing tricks on our perception. But the deeper, more primitive part of my brain recognized something fundamentally wrong with our situation. The forest around us felt alive, watchful, as if every tree concealed eyes that tracked our progress. The road seemed to pulse beneath the tires, a rhythm that matched no earthly heartbeat. And Jessica's profile, illuminated by the dashboard lights, looked somehow different. Her features subtly shifted, as if I were seeing her through water or thick glass. The shimmer ahead intensified, and suddenly we were through it. The sensation like passing through a membrane between worlds. The forest abruptly opened up, revealing a cluster of lights in the distance, the familiar glow of civilization, of restaurants and gas stations and normal human activity. Jessica's shoulders sagged with relief, and she turned to me with a smile that almost looked genuine. The Mockingbird Diner sat exactly where she'd promised it would be, its neon sign casting familiar pink and blue shadows across the parking lot. Other cars were scattered around the lot, their occupants visible through the restaurant's windows, eating normal food and having normal conversations. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as I'd expected when we'd started this journey hours ago. But when I looked down at my phone, the screen still showed the same impossible maze of roads, our location marker blinking steadily at the center of the forest we'd supposedly left behind. The odometer confirmed that we'd traveled exactly 70 miles, but according to every GPS satellite in orbit, we'd never moved at all. Jessica was already unbuckling her seatbelt, chattering about the menu, and apologizing for the longer drive than expected. Her voice sounded normal again, musical and warm, as if the tense silence of the past hour had never existed. When she asked if I was ready to go inside, I nodded automatically, though my eyes remained fixed on the phone screen. The location marker continued to blink at the center of the maze, steady and unchanging, like a digital heartbeat marking time in a place that couldn't exist. As we walked toward the restaurant, I noticed that our footsteps seemed to echo strangely on the asphalt, as if the ground beneath us were hollow, or perhaps not quite real. The diner's door chimed as we entered, and the warmth inside felt like a physical embrace after the inexplicable cold of the car. Jessica guided me to a booth near the window, where I could see our reflection in the glass. Two ordinary people on an ordinary date, nothing more unusual than a graduate student and his Tinder match sharing a meal. But in the reflection, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Behind us, visible through the restaurant's windows, the parking lot was empty. No cars, no lights, no signs of the civilization we'd just walked through, only an endless expanse of forest, stretching away into darkness that seemed to swallow light itself. When I turned to look directly through the window, everything appeared normal again. Cars, street lights, the familiar geometry of human habitation. But the reflection continued to show only trees, as if the mirror world existed in a different reality than the one we inhabited. Jessica was studying the menu, her finger tracing the laminated pages with the same concentration she'd shown while navigating the impossible roads. When she looked up at me, her eyes held a question I couldn't quite decipher, as if she were waiting for me to understand something crucial about our situation. The waitress approached our table, her footsteps silent on the linoleum floor, and I realized with growing horror that I couldn't remember the sound of the door chime when we'd entered. In fact, I couldn't remember the sound of anything since we'd passed through the shimmer on the forest road. No ambient noise, no conversation from other diners, nothing but the hollow echo of our own voices in a space that might not exist at all. Jessica was still waiting for my answer to her question, though I couldn't remember what she'd asked. Her smile remained constant, perfectly pleasant, as if she had all the time in the world to wait for my response. Behind her, the reflection in the window continued to show only forest, only darkness, only the endless maze of roads that led nowhere and everywhere at once. I looked down at my phone one last time, and the screen showed the same impossible tangle of roads, our location marker blinking steadily at the center of a place that couldn't exist. The battery indicator showed 100%, though I hadn't charged it since morning. The time displayed 8:47 p.m., though it had been 8:15 when we'd arrived at the restaurant. Or perhaps we'd never arrived at all. Perhaps we were still driving through the maze of forest roads, still trapped in the endless loop that the GPS insisted we'd never escaped. Perhaps Jessica's smile was just another reflection in the window, another trick of light and shadow in a world where nothing was quite what it seemed. The waitress was still approaching our table, her footsteps still silent, her face a blur of features that refused to resolve into focus. Jessica was still waiting for my answer, her finger still tracing the same line of text on the menu. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible above the silence, I could hear the steady thumping of patched asphalt beneath tires. the rhythm of a journey that might never end. The location marker continued to blink at the center of the maze, steady and unchanging, marking time in a place that existed somewhere between reality and nightmare, between the world of GPS satellites and the deeper geography of impossible roads that led everywhere and nowhere at once. Story 10. The dreams had been coming back for 3 weeks now, always the same sequence. I'm small again, weightless, being carried down those narrow basement stairs in gentle, rhythmic movements. The sensation of arms around me, protective and warm, while the wooden steps creak beneath unseen feet. I wake each morning with the phantom feeling of being rocked, as if my adult body still remembers the careful descent into darkness. I hadn't thought about those dreams in decades, not since childhood, when they came so frequently that I'd learned to anticipate them, to find comfort in their predictable cadence. But now, at 42, working as a librarian in Cleveland's downtown branch, they'd returned with startling clarity. The timing felt significant, though I couldn't say why. It was Mrs. Patterson who unknowingly provided the catalyst. She'd been renting my parents' old house on Maple Street for nearly 6 years, ever since Dad's stroke forced them into assisted living. A reliable tenant who paid on time and maintained the property well, she'd never called with concerns before. But last Tuesday, her voice carried an unfamiliar tension when she described the marks on the basement stairway handrail. "They look like scratches," she'd explained, her words careful and measured. "Or maybe scuff marks, like something heavy was dragged along the wood, going down toward the basement." I'd assured her it was probably nothing serious, perhaps furniture being moved by the previous tenants. But her description nagged at me through the following days, weaving itself into my returning dreams. The sensation of being carried became more vivid, more specific. I began to remember details I'd forgotten. The smell of old wood and basement dampness, the way afternoon light filtered through the kitchen window above, casting shifting shadows on the stairway walls. By Saturday, I'd convinced myself that seeing the marks would put both the dreams and Mrs. Patterson's concerns to rest. I called ahead, explaining that I wanted to check the handrail myself, perhaps arrange for refinishing if needed. She agreed readily, mentioning that she'd be out for the afternoon visiting her sister. The house stood exactly as I remembered it from childhood, though it seemed smaller now, as adult spaces often do. The same faded blue siding, the same narrow front porch where I'd spent countless summer evenings reading. Mrs. Patterson had maintained the gardens well. The rose bushes my mother had planted still bloomed along the walkway, their fragrance carrying memories of June afternoons and library books. I used my old key, surprised it still worked after all these years. The interior had changed significantly. Mrs. Patterson's furniture and decorations had transformed the familiar rooms into something foreign yet comfortable. But the basement door remained in its original location, just off the kitchen, and when I opened it, the same musty air rose to meet me. The stairway handrail showed the marks immediately. They were more pronounced than I'd expected, running along the smooth wood in parallel lines about 18 inches apart. The scratches appeared deliberate, too consistent to be accidental scuffing. They began at the top of the stairs and continued down the right side, following the handrail's entire length until it ended at the basement floor. I ran my fingers along the marks, feeling their depth and texture. They were old, worn smooth by time, but definitely carved into the wood rather than simply scraped across its surface. The pattern was unmistakable, 2 parallel lines, as if something with a consistent width had been dragged or pushed along the rail repeatedly over time. Standing there in the familiar stairway, I felt the dream sensation return with unexpected intensity, the feeling of being carried, of gentle motion downward, of safety and warmth. But now it carried a different quality, something I couldn't quite identify. I found myself measuring the distance between the marks with my hands, spreading my fingers to match their width. 18 inches. The measurement stuck in my mind as I locked the house and drove home, replaying Mrs. Patterson's description and my own observations. 18 inches seemed significant, though I couldn't place why. That evening, I found myself in the public library's basement storage, searching through old city directories and real estate records, looking for any documentation of my parents' house that might explain the marks. The dreams that night were different. Instead of the comforting sensation of being carried, I experienced the journey from another perspective. I was moving down the stairs, but not walking, sliding, pushing something ahead of me. The wooden rail passed beneath my right side, and I could feel it wearing smooth under repeated contact. The dream carried a sense of purpose, of routine, as if this descent was a familiar task performed countless times. I woke disturbed, the phantom sensation of pushing rather than being carried lingering in my morning consciousness. The change in perspective felt important, though I couldn't articulate why. At work, I found myself distracted, mechanically processing returned books, while my mind returned to the basement stairs and their mysterious marks. Mrs. Patterson called Wednesday evening, her voice carrying that same careful tension as before. She'd been doing laundry in the basement, she explained, and had noticed something odd about the marks. They seemed to continue beyond the handrail, she said, extending across the basement floor itself in faint parallel lines that disappeared beneath the old furnace. I asked if I could come look again, and she agreed, though she mentioned feeling uncomfortable in the basement since first noticing the marks. There was something about them, she said, that made her feel watched, as if the house itself was paying attention to her movements. Thursday afternoon found me back in the familiar basement, flashlight in hand, following the faint tracks across the concrete floor. Mrs. Patterson was right. The marks continued beyond the stairway, worn into the cement itself in barely visible parallel lines. They led directly to the area beneath the old furnace, where the floor showed signs of long-term wear in a rectangular pattern. I knelt beside the furnace, running my flashlight along the floor's surface. The wear marks formed a clear rectangle, approximately 18 inches wide and perhaps 3 feet long. The concrete was polished smooth within this area, as if something had rested there for extended periods, shifting slightly with each placement. The dimensions triggered a memory I'd been avoiding. In the garage behind my apartment, wrapped in plastic and stored among other items from my parents' house, sat my old baby carriage. I'd inherited it along with various other household items, thinking someday I might need it for my own family. But I'd never married, never had children, and the carriage had remained untouched for years. That evening, I found myself in the garage, pulling away the plastic covering. The carriage was exactly as I remembered it, navy blue canvas with chrome handles, the kind popular in the 1980s. I measured its width with a tape measure, though I already knew what I'd find. 18 inches exactly. The wheels were old but still functional, rolling smoothly across the garage floor. I pushed it experimentally, noting how the right side bumper would naturally track against any wall or rail it encountered. The height was perfect for contact with the basement handrail, and the carriage's length matched the worn rectangle beneath the furnace. But the implications made no sense. I had no memory of the carriage being used in the basement, no recollection of trips up and down those stairs. My parents had sold it at a garage sale when I was perhaps 5 years old, along with other baby items I'd outgrown. I remembered watching strangers examine it, remembered the odd sadness of seeing it loaded into someone else's car. Yet the evidence was unmistakable. The marks on the handrail, the wear patterns on the basement floor, the perfect dimensional match, all pointed to years of regular use, of countless trips down those stairs. But use for what purpose? And by whom? The dreams intensified over the following days, becoming more detailed and specific. I began to experience them from both perspectives simultaneously, the sensation of being carried and the effort of pushing the carriage. The dual awareness was disorienting, creating a strange feedback loop where I couldn't distinguish between being transported and doing the transporting. I found myself returning to the house repeatedly, always when Mrs. Patterson was out, using the key she'd given me for maintenance purposes. Each visit revealed new details, faint impressions in the basement's concrete where the carriage wheels had worn circular patterns, scratches on the stairway walls at exactly the height the carriage handles would reach, even slight depressions in the wooden steps themselves, where weight had been repeatedly applied. The evidence suggested decades of use, far beyond the 5 years I'd supposedly owned the carriage. But more disturbing was the growing certainty that I remembered this routine, that somewhere in my mind lay clear memories of making these trips, of carefully maneuvering the carriage down the narrow stairs, of parking it in its designated spot beneath the furnace. Mrs. Patterson noticed my increased visits and began asking questions. I explained that I was researching the house's history, trying to understand some architectural details. She accepted this readily enough, though she mentioned that she'd been having strange dreams since discovering the marks. Dreams of being carried down into darkness, of gentle rocking motion, of safety and warmth. Her description matched my own experiences so precisely that I felt a chill of recognition. We were sharing the same dream, the same memories, as if the house itself was broadcasting them to anyone who spent enough time within its walls. The realization should have been alarming, but instead, I felt a strange comfort, as if Mrs. Patterson's experiences validated my own. I began visiting the house at night, letting myself in after Mrs. Patterson had gone to bed. The basement held a different quality in darkness, and I found myself drawn to the area beneath the furnace where the carriage had apparently rested. Sitting in that worn rectangle, I could almost feel the carriage's presence, could almost hear the faint sounds of movement from the stairs above. The dreams began occurring while I was awake, overlaying my normal perception with ghostly images of the carriage in motion. I'd see it being pushed down the stairs, empty but somehow purposeful, guided by invisible hands toward its resting place. The visions were so vivid that I sometimes reached out to touch the carriage's handles, expecting to feel the smooth chrome beneath my fingers. One night, sitting in the basement's darkness, I heard the sound I'd been unconsciously anticipating. Footsteps on the stairs above, measured and careful, accompanied by the soft scraping of wheels against wood. The handrail creaked under contact, and I could hear the gentle bump of the carriage's body against the stair walls as it was maneuvered downward. I remained perfectly still, not daring to move or breathe, as the sounds approached. The footsteps reached the basement floor, and I heard the carriage being pushed across the concrete toward my location. The sound stopped just feet away, and I could sense a presence in the darkness, something waiting and watching. But when I finally gathered courage to turn on my flashlight, the basement was empty. Only the familiar marks on the floor and the worn rectangle where I sat provided evidence of the carriage's long history in this space. Yet the sensation of being watched remained, as if something had noticed my presence and was deciding how to respond. I began to understand that the dreams weren't memories in the traditional sense. They were invitations, attempts to draw me back into a pattern that had been interrupted when the carriage was sold. The house remembered its routine, remembered the comfort of that gentle descent into darkness, and was trying to restore what had been lost. Mrs. Patterson moved out the following week, claiming that the basement had become too uncomfortable for her to continue living there. She left no forwarding address, simply packed her belongings and disappeared, leaving behind only the monthly rent and a note explaining that she couldn't stay any longer. I found myself spending entire nights in the empty house, sitting in the basement, waiting for the sounds to return. The dreams had stopped coming during sleep, but the waking visions grew stronger. I could see the carriage clearly now, could watch it being pushed down the stairs with careful precision, could follow its path across the basement floor to its designated resting place. The realization came gradually, building over several nights of observation. The carriage wasn't empty during these visions. It carried something, someone, precious cargo being transported with infinite care from the kitchen above to the safety of the basement below. The trips were routine, necessary, performed with the kind of gentle repetition that speaks of love and protection. I began to remember being that cargo, remember the security of being wrapped in blankets and carried down into the cool darkness. The basement had been my sanctuary, my safe place, where I could rest undisturbed while the world above continued its chaotic pace. The carriage had been my vehicle, my means of transportation between the bright confusion of the kitchen and the quiet peace of the basement depths. But the memories felt too old, too detailed, stretching back beyond my earliest childhood recollections. They suggested years of trips, hundreds of descents, a routine that had continued far longer than my parents' care could explain. The timeline didn't match my known history, yet the experiences felt undeniably real, undeniably mine. Now, sitting in the basement of my childhood home, I understand that some routines transcend individual memory, that certain patterns become embedded in the places where they occur. The house remembers what was lost when the carriage was sold, remembers the comfort of those gentle trips between worlds, remembers the safety of the basement sanctuary. The marks on the handrail continue to deepen, worn smooth by passage that may be memory or may be something more. I sit in the worn rectangle beneath the furnace, feeling the weight of invisible blankets, hearing the creak of wheels on wooden stairs, knowing that somewhere above, careful hands are guiding precious cargo toward the darkness where it belongs. The dreams have returned, but now I'm not sure if I'm remembering them or living them. Not sure if the carriage exists in the past or the present. Not sure if the gentle motion down those familiar stairs is memory or invitation. The basement holds its secrets close, and I find myself content to remain here, waiting for the next descent, the next careful journey into the safety of the depths below. Story 11. The microwave's digital display read 3:47 a.m. when I first noticed Sarah's breathing change. Not the gentle rhythm of sleep, but something deliberate, measured, like she was listening to instructions only she could hear. I'd been debugging code for 6 hours straight, the glow of my laptop screen painting our cramped St. Louis apartment in sickly blue light, when the sound pulled me from my concentration. She sat upright in bed, her silhouette perfectly still against the window where streetlight filtered through Venetian blinds, casting prison bar shadows across her face. The apartment's heating system kicked in with its usual mechanical wheeze, but underneath that familiar sound, I heard something else. A whisper, soft and continuous, like static from an old radio searching for a signal. Sarah's lips were moving. I minimized my IDE and strained to listen, but the words dissolved into unintelligible murmurs the moment I focused on them. She spoke for maybe 30 seconds before lying back down, her breathing returning to normal sleep patterns. I watched her for another 10 minutes, but she remained motionless, her face peaceful in the dim light. The next morning, she had no memory of it. Sarah laughed when I mentioned her late-night monologue. Her coffee mug paused halfway to her lips. She'd been having vivid dreams lately, she explained, probably stress from her new job at the marketing firm. The adjustment period was rough, new colleagues, new expectations, new everything. She kissed my forehead and headed to work, leaving me alone with the lingering scent of her perfume and a nagging certainty that what I'd witnessed wasn't a dream. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, I was ready. I'd positioned myself at the kitchen counter with my laptop, angled so I could see both the bed and the microwave's reflective surface, a habit I'd developed after years of using it as a makeshift mirror while coding late into the night. The apartment's layout forced this arrangement. Bedroom, kitchen, and living room all crammed into 600 square feet of gentrified space that cost more than my parents' mortgage. At 2:33 a.m., Sarah's breathing shifted. The same deliberate rhythm, the same unnatural stillness. But this time, when she sat up, I caught something in the microwave's dark reflection that made my blood freeze. Her face looked wrong, not dramatically different, but subtly off, like a photograph that had been adjusted just enough to fall into uncanny valley territory. Her mouth moved with mechanical precision, and though I couldn't make out the words, the cadence suggested she was responding to someone. I held my breath, afraid any movement would break whatever spell held her. The refrigerator hummed. The upstairs neighbor's footsteps creaked across our ceiling. Sarah continued her one-sided conversation for nearly 5 minutes before lying back down, and I remained frozen at the counter until dawn, afraid to move, afraid to sleep, afraid to acknowledge what I'd witnessed. The episodes became more frequent. Every few nights, sometimes multiple times in a single night. I started keeping a journal, documenting the times, the duration, any details I could remember. The conversations grew longer, more animated. Sarah would gesture with her hands, nod, even shake her head in apparent disagreement. But she never spoke loudly enough for me to understand the words. I considered recording her, but something held me back. The idea felt like a violation, despite the fact that she was my girlfriend of 2 years. Despite the fact that whatever was happening scared me more than anything I'd experienced since childhood nightmares. Instead, I watched and waited, hoping the episodes would stop on their own. They didn't stop. They escalated. It started with small things during the day. Sarah would pause mid-sentence, her expression vacant, as if she was listening to something I couldn't hear. She'd lose track of conversations, forget plans we'd made, misplace items she'd just set down. When I brought these lapses to her attention, she'd laugh them off, blaming work stress or lack of sleep. But her eyes held a flicker of something else. Fear, maybe, or confusion. The apartment itself seemed to respond to her condition. Lights flickered when she experienced her daytime episodes. The heating system would shut off abruptly, leaving us in sudden, uncomfortable silence. Electronics malfunctioned. The television would change channels on its own. The microwave would beep at random intervals, and my laptop would crash whenever she entered the room during one of her spells. I began to dread coming home. The apartment felt charged, like the air before a thunderstorm. Every shadow seemed deeper, every sound more ominous. I'd find excuses to stay late at work, grabbing dinner at the diner down the street, walking the long way home through Forest Park, just to delay my return. But no matter how late I arrived, I'd find Sarah exactly where I'd left her, often in the same position, as if she'd been waiting for me without moving. The worst part was the growing certainty that whatever was happening to Sarah was connected to our apartment. She never had episodes at work, never during our weekend visits to her parents in Illinois, never when we went out for dinner or to the movies. Only within these walls did she transform into someone, something else. I started researching the building's history, digging through property records and old newspaper archives. The apartment complex had been built in 1987 on the site of a demolished psychiatric facility. The original building had housed patients from the 1920s through the 1970s, before being shut down due to budget cuts and changing attitudes toward mental health treatment. I found several articles about the facility's closure, but nothing about unusual incidents or deaths. Still, the knowledge unsettled me. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, convinced I could hear footsteps in the hallway, voices through the walls, the distant sound of doors opening and closing. The apartment's familiar sounds, the hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the whisper of air through the heating vents, began to feel malevolent, like they were part of some larger, sinister symphony. Sarah's episodes grew more intense. She'd sit up in bed and carry on lengthy conversations, sometimes for hours. Her voice would change subtly, adopting different inflections, different speech patterns. Once I could have sworn she was speaking in a slight accent, though I couldn't place its origin. Another time she laughed, a sound so unlike her normal laugh that I instinctively reached for my phone to call 911 before remembering that she wasn't technically in danger. Or was she? The question haunted me. What if something was genuinely wrong with her? What if she was developing some form of mental illness, and my supernatural theories were just my way of avoiding the harsh reality of her condition? I'd read about dissociative disorders, schizophrenia, various forms of psychosis. The symptoms could manifest in ways that seemed otherworldly to someone without medical training. But the electronics, the lights, the way the apartment itself seemed to respond to her condition, these weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were environmental phenomena that I was witnessing with my own eyes. Weren't they? I began to question my own perception. Maybe the stress of watching Sarah's condition deteriorate was affecting my judgment. Maybe I was seeing patterns that didn't exist, attributing normal electrical issues to supernatural causes. The human mind was capable of incredible self-deception, especially when faced with situations it couldn't comprehend. But then came the night that changed everything. I'd been working late again, this time genuinely, a critical bug in our application that needed fixing before the morning demo. Sarah had gone to bed around 10, and I'd settled into my usual spot at the kitchen counter, laptop open, coffee cooling beside me. The apartment was quiet except for the familiar background hum of city life. Distant traffic, the occasional siren, the muffled sounds of neighbors living their lives. At 1:17 a.m., Sarah's breathing changed. I looked up from my code, Watching her reflection in the microwave's dark surface, she sat up slowly, her movements fluid and deliberate. But this time, instead of beginning her usual one-sided conversation, she stood up and walked to the kitchen. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. She'd never left the bed during one of her episodes. She moved with purpose, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, her nightgown ghostly pale in the apartment's ambient light. She opened the utility drawer, the one where we kept tools, batteries, and miscellaneous household items, and withdrew the claw hammer I'd used to hang pictures when we'd first moved in. The weight of it seemed natural in her hands, as if she'd held it countless times before. She tested its balance, then turned toward me, her eyes open but unseeing, her expression blank. My heart hammered against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to call for help, to do anything except sit there watching my girlfriend approach me with a weapon. But I was paralyzed by the surreal nature of the situation. This was Sarah, the woman who cried during animal rescue commercials, who'd never raised her voice in anger, who fell asleep holding my hand every night. She stopped 3 feet away from me, the hammer raised slightly, and for the first time in weeks, I could hear her words clearly. "You shouldn't be watching," she said, but her voice carried an unfamiliar inflection, a cadence that belonged to someone else entirely. "Some things are meant to remain private." I wanted to respond, to ask who was speaking, to demand an explanation. But terror had stolen my voice. I could only stare at her face, searching for any sign of the woman I loved beneath this stranger's mask. She raised the hammer higher, and I noticed something that made my blood turn to ice. In the microwave's reflection, there were 3 figures: Sarah, myself, and someone else. A third presence standing between us, translucent but unmistakably human. The reflection showed Sarah's arm moving, but not of her own volition. Something else was guiding her movements, something that existed in the reflection but not in the physical world. The realization hit me like a physical blow. Whatever was happening to Sarah wasn't mental illness or supernatural possession in the traditional sense. It was something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between perception and reality, in the gap between what we see and what we understand. Sarah's grip on the hammer tightened, and I braced myself for the inevitable blow. But instead of striking me, she caught sight of our reflection in the microwave's surface, the same reflection I'd been watching in horror. She saw the third figure, saw the way it stood behind her with its hands overlapping hers on the hammer's handle, saw the way it smiled with her mouth while her eyes remained distant and afraid. The hammer clattered to the floor as Sarah stumbled backward, her own voice returning with a strangled gasp. She looked at me, then at the hammer, then at the microwave's dark surface, where now only 2 figures stood, just her and me, normal and human and terrified. "What did I do?" she whispered, her voice small and broken. What did I do? I couldn't answer. I couldn't move. I couldn't process what I'd witnessed. The apartment felt different now, charged with malevolent energy that seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. The heating system kicked in with its usual mechanical wheeze, but underneath that familiar sound, I heard something else. A whisper, soft and continuous, like static from an old radio searching for a signal. Sarah fled to the bedroom, but I remained in the kitchen, staring at the microwave's reflective surface. The third figure was gone, but I could still feel its presence, watching from wherever it had retreated, waiting for the next opportunity to emerge. I picked up the hammer and returned it to the drawer, my hands shaking so badly I could barely grip it. Then I sat back down at the counter and opened my laptop. Not to debug code, but to research a different kind of problem entirely. I needed to understand what was happening to us, what was happening to Sarah, what was happening in this apartment. I needed to know if we were dealing with something supernatural, something psychological, or something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between those possibilities. But first, I needed to set up a camera. The next morning, Sarah remembered nothing. She found me at the kitchen counter, still awake, still researching. my laptop battery long dead and the screen dark. She asked if I'd been up all night, concern creasing her forehead, and I told her about the work deadline, the critical bug, the need to fix everything before the demo. She believed me, or pretended to. She made coffee, kissed my forehead, and prepared for another day at the marketing firm. But before she left, she paused at the door and looked back at me with an expression I'd never seen before. A mixture of fear and confusion, and something else. Something that might have been recognition. "I had the strangest dream," she said softly. "I dreamed I was someone else, somewhere else. But I can't remember who or where." She left before I could respond, and I spent the day setting up the camera, positioning it to capture both the bed and the microwave's reflective surface. I tested the angle, the lighting, the memory card capacity. I researched the building's history more thoroughly, diving deeper into the psychiatric facility's records, looking for any mention of unusual incidents, unexplained deaths, or mysterious disappearances. I found nothing concrete, but I did discover something interesting. The facility had been known for its experimental treatments, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s. Sensory deprivation, experimental drugs, and what the records euphemistically called consciousness exploration therapy. Several patients had reported experiences that medical staff dismissed as hallucinations or delusions, claims of seeing other people in mirrors, of hearing voices that seemed to come from reflective surfaces, of feeling their bodies controlled by unseen forces. The reports were filed away and forgotten, but they painted a picture of something more complex than simple mental illness. They suggested that the patients might have been experiencing something that existed in the intersection of perception and reality, something that could only be glimpsed in reflections and shadows. That night, I waited with the camera running, its red recording light barely visible in the darkness. At 2:45 a.m., Sarah's breathing changed. At 2:47 a.m., she sat up in bed and began her one-sided conversation. At 2:52 a.m., she stood up and walked to the kitchen, her movements fluid and deliberate. But this time I was ready. This time, I had proof. She opened the drawer again, withdrew the hammer again, approached me with the same blank expression and unfamiliar voice. But this time, I watched not just her reflection, but the camera's viewfinder, and what I saw there made me question everything I thought I understood about reality. The camera captured Sarah's movements, her blank expression, her raised hammer, but it also captured something else, a distortion in the air around her, a ripple in the fabric of the recorded image that suggested the presence of something that existed just beyond the normal spectrum of perception. In the microwave's reflection, the third figure stood clearer than ever, its features more defined, its expression more malevolent. It was human in shape but wrong in every other way. Too tall, too thin, its proportions subtly off, its movements too fluid, too controlled. It moved with Sarah's body but was clearly separate from her, clearly in control of her actions while she remained trapped inside her own skull. The figure looked directly at the camera, and I realized with growing horror that it knew I was recording. It smiled, an expression that used Sarah's mouth but belonged to someone else entirely, and raised the hammer higher. But then Sarah caught sight of the reflection again, saw the third figure, saw the way it controlled her movements, and the cycle repeated. The hammer dropped. The figure retreated. Sarah stumbled backward in confusion and fear. I stopped recording and stared at the camera's small screen, watching the footage play back in slow motion. The distortion was there, clear and unmistakable. The third figure was visible in the reflection. The evidence was irrefutable. But evidence of what? I spent the rest of the night reviewing the footage, analyzing every frame, looking for clues that might explain what we were dealing with. The images raised more questions than they answered. Was the figure some kind of entity that existed in reflected spaces? Was it a manifestation of psychological trauma? Was it something else entirely? Something that existed in the spaces between our understanding of reality? The more I studied the footage, the more I began to suspect that these weren't mutually exclusive possibilities. Maybe the figure was all of these things simultaneously. A psychological manifestation that had achieved some form of independent existence, a trauma that had become tangible, a piece of the psychiatric facility's dark history, that had somehow embedded itself in the fabric of our apartment. Or maybe I was losing my mind. The thought crept in slowly, quietly, like water through a crack in the foundation. Maybe Sarah was having some kind of breakdown, and my desperate need to find a supernatural explanation was causing me to see things that weren't there. Maybe the distortion in the footage was just a camera malfunction, the figure in the reflection just a trick of light and shadow, my entire theory just an elaborate delusion constructed to avoid facing the truth about my girlfriend's deteriorating mental health. But the hammer was real. The fear in Sarah's eyes was real. The way she moved during her episodes. The way she spoke in voices that weren't her own. The way electronics malfunctioned in her presence. These weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were something else entirely, weren't they? I needed to know for certain. I needed to understand what was happening to us, what was happening to Sarah, what was happening in this apartment. I needed to know if we were dealing with something supernatural, something psychological, or something else entirely, something that existed in the spaces between those possibilities. But most importantly, I needed to know if Sarah was still in there, somewhere beneath the surface, fighting to regain control of her own mind and body. Because the footage showed something else, something I'd almost missed in my focus on the third figure. In the moments before Sarah caught sight of the reflection, before she dropped the hammer and stumbled backward, there was something in her eyes. A flicker of awareness, a glimpse of recognition, a silent scream for help that only someone who knew her well enough to read her expressions could detect. She was still there, trapped inside her own skull, watching in horror as something else controlled her movements, spoke with her voice, used her body to carry out actions she would never willingly perform. And that realization was more terrifying than any supernatural entity, more disturbing than any psychological explanation, more horrifying than any truth I might uncover. Because it meant that whatever was happening to us, whatever was happening to Sarah, whatever was happening in this apartment, it was just the beginning. Story 12. The August heat pressed against the windows of Grandpa's lake house like fever-warm palms, but the basement held on to winter's chill with jealous fingers. I'd brought my nephews here for what was supposed to be a simple weekend retreat, a chance to escape the suffocating routine of lectures and faculty meetings. The old man had left me the place in his will 6 months ago, and I'd been too consumed with work to properly explore what I'd inherited. The boys had claimed the upstairs bedrooms and were already splashing in the lake, their laughter echoing off the water like gunshots in the stillness. I stood in the basement doorway, breathing in the scent of old wood and something else, something metallic and patient that seemed to seep from the walls themselves. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light from the single bulb, and I noticed how they moved in patterns that defied the complete absence of air currents. The basement stretched longer than seemed possible given the house's modest footprint above. Shelves lined the walls like sentinels, packed with the accumulated detritus of decades. Paint cans with labels so faded they might as well have been written in a dead language. Boxes of Christmas decorations that would never again see light. Tools whose purposes had been forgotten by everyone who might have wielded them. In the center of the room sat a ping-pong table, its green surface scarred by years of use, but still functional. I'd been down here twice since arriving yesterday, and both times I'd felt that peculiar sensation of being watched. Not by human eyes, but by something patient and calculating. The feeling crawled up my spine like ice water, making me glance over my shoulder at empty corners where shadows seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. The first sign came that evening. I'd gone downstairs to find a deck of cards for the boys, and I stopped short at the bottom of the stairs. The shelves looked different, not dramatically but subtly wrong. Tools that had been arranged in one configuration now sat in another. A hammer that had been lying flat now stood upright against a coffee can. Paintbrushes that had been scattered were now arranged in a neat row, their bristles all pointing in the same direction. I stood there for a full minute, trying to reconstruct my earlier visits, wondering if I'd simply misremembered. Memory I knew from years of academic study was unreliable. The mind filled in gaps, constructed narratives, imposed order where none existed. But the certainty in my gut told me something different. These objects had moved. The ping pong table sat exactly where it had before, positioned dead center in the room. I walked around it slowly, noting how it seemed to command the space, how everything else felt arranged in relation to it. The net was still in place, slightly sagging in the middle, and two paddles lay on the surface as if waiting for players who would never come. I found the cards in a dusty box on the third shelf and made my way back upstairs, but the image of that rearranged basement stayed with me. Over dinner, I found myself distracted, pushing food around my plate while the boys chattered about their day. The lake stretched beyond the windows like a dark mirror, reflecting the last purple traces of sunset. That night, I lay in bed listening to the house settle around me. Every creak and groan seemed amplified, each sound a potential signal of movement below. I told myself I was being ridiculous. Old houses made noise, objects could appear to have moved due to faulty memory, and basements were naturally unsettling places. But sleep eluded me until the early hours, and when I finally dozed, my dreams were filled with shifting shadows and watching eyes. The next morning brought fresh evidence. I'd gone down to the basement before the boys woke, coffee mug in hand, telling myself I was just checking on things. The shelves had rearranged themselves again, more dramatically this time. An entire section of paint cans had been rotated 90 degrees, their labels now facing away from the room's center. A stack of magazines had been moved from the floor to a higher shelf, and a toolbox that had been closed was now open. Its contents spread across the surface in a fan pattern. But it was the ping pong table that made my breath catch. It had moved. Not far, just a few inches, but enough to be unmistakable. It now sat at an angle that blocked the path to the far end of the basement, where I'd noticed a tall cabinet pressed against the wall. The table's position seemed deliberate, protective, as if it were standing guard. I set down my coffee and walked to the cabinet, having to angle my body around the table's edge. The piece of furniture was old and imposing, reaching nearly to the ceiling. Its doors were sealed shut with a series of nails driven deep into the wood, their heads painted over so many times they barely protruded from the surface. The work looked hasty, almost frantic, as if someone had been trying to keep something in rather than keep something out. I ran my fingers along the nail heads, feeling the rough texture of layered paint. The wood around them was scarred, as if someone had tried to pry them out at some point and given up. There was no handle on the doors, no obvious way to open them even if the nails were removed. The whole thing radiated a sense of finality, of secrets meant to stay buried. By the time the boys came down for breakfast, I'd convinced myself I needed to document what was happening. I couldn't trust my memory, couldn't rely on my perceptions. If the objects were moving, I'd prove it. If they weren't, I'd have evidence of my own instability. I spent the morning in town buying chalk and a tape measure. The boys were happy to spend the day at the lake, and I told them I was working on a project in the basement. They accepted this with the easy indifference of youth, more interested in swimming and fishing than in their uncle's odd behavior. Back in the basement, I meticulously measured and marked the position of everything: the ping pong table, the major shelves, the cabinet. I drew chalk outlines on the concrete floor, marking the exact placement of the table's legs. I photographed everything with my phone, taking shots from multiple angles. If things moved, I'd have proof. The work took hours, and by the time I finished, the basement felt different. The air seemed thicker, more oppressive. The shadows in the corners appeared deeper, more substantial. I found myself glancing repeatedly at the sealed cabinet, wondering what my grandfather had been so determined to keep locked away. That evening, I checked my phone obsessively, scrolling through the photos I'd taken. The boys went to bed early, exhausted from their day in the sun, and I sat in the living room pretending to read, while my mind remained fixed on the basement below. Every sound the house made seemed to originate from that underground space, as if the building itself were shifting and breathing around whatever was down there. I made it until midnight before I couldn't stand it anymore. I crept down the stairs, phone in hand, ready to compare the current state with my documented evidence. The basement greeted me with its familiar chill, but something felt different. The air moved differently, carrying scents I hadn't noticed before. Earth and metal and something organic that made my nose wrinkle. The ping-pong table had moved again. This time it had traveled nearly 2 feet, positioning itself even more directly in front of the cabinet. My chalk outlines lay empty, the table's legs now resting on unmarked concrete. I checked my phone, comparing the current scene with my photographs. The difference was undeniable. More disturbing was the condition of the shelves. The rearrangement had accelerated, become more chaotic. Tools lay scattered across the floor in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, like symbols or messages in a language I couldn't read. Paint cans had been stacked in precarious towers that defied gravity. The whole room looked like the aftermath of a frantic search, as if someone or something had been looking for something specific. I approached the cabinet again, having to climb over the ping-pong table's edge to reach it. Up close, I could see that some of the nails had been worked loose, their heads protruding further from the wood than I remembered. Long scratches marked the doors, as if something inside had been trying to claw its way out. Standing there in the basement's artificial light, surrounded by the evidence of impossible movement, I felt my rational mind fracturing. I was a professor, a man of science and logic. I understood the difference between perception and reality, between correlation and causation. But I also understood what my senses were telling me. Something in this basement was alive, aware, and increasingly active. I backed away from the cabinet, my heart hammering against my ribs. The basement suddenly felt too small, too confined. The ceiling seemed to press down, and the walls appeared to lean inward. I had to get out, had to breathe fresh air and convince myself that reality remained stable. But as I turned to leave, I heard it, a soft scraping sound from behind me. I spun around to see the ping-pong table shifting, its legs dragging across the concrete floor. It moved slowly, deliberately, positioning itself more firmly between me and the cabinet. The scratching sound continued, rhythmic and purposeful, like fingernails on wood. I ran then, abandoning any pretense of scientific observation. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my phone forgotten in my trembling hands. Behind me, the scraping continued, accompanied now by a sound like settling wood, or like something large taking a deep breath. In the living room, I collapsed into a chair and tried to process what I'd witnessed. The logical part of my mind offered explanations. Settling foundation, temperature changes causing wood to expand and contract, mice or other small animals disturbing the stored items. But these rational thoughts felt thin and insubstantial against the weight of what I'd experienced. I spent the rest of the night in that chair, dozing fitfully and waking at every sound. When morning came, I was hollow-eyed and shaking, my nerves stretched to their breaking point. The boys found me there and asked if I was feeling all right. I managed to smile and deflect their concern, but I could see the worry in their eyes. I didn't go back to the basement that day. Instead, I called my grandfather's former neighbor, an elderly woman who'd known him for decades. She agreed to meet me at the local diner, and over coffee and pie, I carefully broached the subject of the lake house. She spoke warmly of my grandfather, describing him as a kind man who'd kept to himself in his later years. But when I mentioned the basement, her expression changed. She became guarded, reluctant to meet my eyes. Finally, she admitted that my grandfather had seemed troubled in his final months, talking about needing to keep certain things contained. He'd mentioned sealing up parts of the house, making sure nothing could get out. I pressed her for details, but she claimed not to know more. As we parted ways, however, she gripped my arm and spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Some things are better left alone," she said. "Your grandfather understood that." That evening, I stood at the basement door, key in hand, debating whether to lock it and leave it sealed. The boys were packing upstairs, our weekend visit coming to an end. I could simply close the door, drive back to the city, and pretend none of this had happened. I could sell the house, let someone else deal with whatever was down there. But I knew I couldn't leave without knowing. The academic in me, the part that had spent years pursuing truth and understanding, wouldn't allow it. I had to see what was happening, had to witness the final act of whatever drama was playing out below. I opened the door and descended the stairs one last time. The basement was in chaos now, the shelves completely rearranged, tools and supplies scattered across the floor in patterns that hurt to look at directly. The ping-pong table had moved again, positioning itself at an angle that provided a clear view of the cabinet while still blocking direct access to it. The nails holding the cabinet doors had worked themselves loose, some now protruding several inches from the wood. The doors themselves seemed to bulge outward, as if something inside were pressing against them. I could hear sounds from within. Not the scraping I'd heard before, but something rhythmic and organic like breathing. I approached slowly, my phone held up to record whatever was about to happen. The basement's air felt electric, charged with potential energy. Every step forward required enormous effort, as if I were walking through thick liquid. The breathing from the cabinet grew more pronounced, more labored, as if whatever was inside were struggling to break free. I reached the cabinet just as the first nail popped completely out of the wood, clattering to the floor with a sound like a gunshot. Then another, and another. The doors began to open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. The breathing became a roar, and I realized with dawning horror that the sound wasn't coming from inside the cabinet. It was coming from the basement itself, from the walls and floor and ceiling. The entire room was breathing. I stood there, phone in hand, watching as reality unraveled around me. The basement expanded and contracted like lungs, the walls pulsing with organic rhythm. The scattered tools and supplies weren't randomly arranged. They were forming patterns, creating symbols, spelling out messages in a language older than human speech. And through it all, the ping-pong table held its position, guardian and witness to whatever was emerging from the cabinet's depths. I understood now why my grandfather had sealed it, why he'd spent his final months in fearful vigilance. He'd been keeping something contained, something that had been waiting patiently for the right moment to breathe free. The cabinet doors swung fully open, and the darkness within began to pour out like liquid shadow. I stumbled backward, my rational mind finally, completely shattered. The basement was no longer a basement. It was something alive, something that had been sleeping beneath the house for decades, waiting for the seals to weaken and the guardians to fail. I ran then, fled up the stairs and out of the house, my nephew's confused voices following me into the night. Behind me, the breathing continued, deep and satisfied, as if something long confined had finally found room to expand. We drove back to the city that night, and I never returned to the lake house. I put it on the market the following week, selling it to a young couple who spoke excitedly about renovation projects and basement workshops. I didn't tell them about the ping-pong table or the breathing walls or the cabinet that should never be opened. Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if I dreamed it all. The rational part of my mind, the part that still functions, suggests that stress and isolation and the power of suggestion created a complex hallucination. But I know what I experienced, what I felt, what I heard. The basement is still there, still breathing, still waiting. And somewhere, a ping-pong table stands guard over secrets that should never see the light of day. I only hope the new owners never venture downstairs alone, never mark the movements of objects that shouldn't move, never question why certain doors are sealed with nails driven deep into desperate wood. Some things, my grandfather knew, are better left contained. But containment, I've learned, is only temporary, and some things grow stronger in the dark. Story 13. The moving truck's engine cut out with a mechanical wheeze, leaving behind the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums like cotton soaked in uncertainty. Rochester's autumn air carried the metallic scent of approaching rain, and the house before me, my house now, stood like a weathered monument to someone else's abandoned dreams. Victorian bones wrapped in peeling white paint, windows that reflected nothing but gray sky, and a front porch that sagged under the weight of decades I'd never witnessed. I'd been standing there for maybe 10 minutes when Uncle Ray's voice cut through the afternoon stillness. Looks like you could use a hand with those boxes. I turned to find him approaching from the street, hands stuffed deep in the pockets of his worn leather jacket. Ray had always been the family's restless spirit, the one who showed up unannounced at holiday gatherings, who disappeared for months at a time, who somehow always knew when you needed him most. His presence here shouldn't have surprised me, but something about the way he moved, the deliberate carefulness of his steps, made my stomach tighten. "Ray, what are you doing here?" His grin was the same lopsided smile I remembered from childhood, but his eyes seemed distant, unfocused. "Figured you might need some help settling in. New place, new city. It's a lot for one person to handle." The logic was sound, but Ray lived 3 states away. I hadn't even told him about the move, hadn't spoken to him since last Christmas. Still, I found myself nodding, grateful for the company. The prospect of hauling boxes into that echoing house alone had been weighing on me more than I'd admitted to myself. We worked in comfortable silence for the next 2 hours. Ray moved with surprising efficiency, his weathered hands gripping boxes with practiced ease. He seemed to know exactly where everything should go, directing me toward the living room for the books, the kitchen for the dishes, the spare bedroom for the winter clothes. When I mentioned that I hadn't even decided on room assignments yet, he just shrugged and said he had a feeling about these things. The strangest part was how perfectly he fit into the space. Ray moved through the house like he'd been there before, navigating around the awkward corner in the hallway, knowing instinctively which floorboards creaked under pressure. When I commented on his familiarity with the layout, he paused mid-step, box balanced in his arms, and stared at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Some houses just feel right, you know?" he said finally, like they're waiting for you to come home. By evening, we'd moved everything inside. The house felt less empty with cardboard towers scattered throughout the rooms, but something about the sealed boxes bothered me. They sat in perfect rows, each one labeled in my own handwriting, yet I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching me. Ray had left sometime around 6, claiming he had to hit the road before dark, and I'd been too exhausted to ask where he was going or where he'd even come from. I ordered pizza and ate it standing in the kitchen, staring out the window at the backyard. The property stretched further than I'd realized, ending at a detached garage that looked even older than the house. The realtor had mentioned it in passing, something about the previous owner using it as a workshop, but I hadn't given it much thought. Now, with shadows lengthening across the overgrown grass, it loomed like a question mark against the darkening sky. The phone rang as I was finishing my second slice. My sister Karen's voice crackled through the static of a bad connection. "How's the new place treating you?" "It's good," I said, though I wasn't sure why I was lying. "Ray stopped by to help with the move." The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Karen spoke again, her voice was carefully controlled. "What did you just say?" "Ray helped me move the boxes. He showed up this afternoon, said he figured I could use a hand." "That's impossible." Something cold settled in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "Ray was in a car accident yesterday morning. He's been in the hospital since noon unconscious. The doctors don't know if he's going to make it." The pizza turned to ash in my mouth. I set the slice down with trembling fingers, suddenly aware of how loud my breathing sounded in the empty kitchen. That can't be right. He was here for hours. We moved everything together. "I'm at the hospital right now," Karen said, her voice tight with worry. "He hasn't woken up once. The accident happened at 11:47 a.m. The paramedics logged it. Where exactly do you think you saw him?" I opened my mouth to argue, to insist that Ray had been real, solid, present. But the words died in my throat as I remembered the careful way he'd moved, the distant look in his eyes, the unnatural familiarity with my new house. My hands started shaking, and I had to grip the counter to keep from falling. "I have to go," I whispered, and hung up before Karen could respond. The house felt different after that call. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more oppressive. I found myself checking the locks on every door and window, though I couldn't explain what I was trying to keep out or in. The boxes sat in their neat rows, and I noticed for the first time that they weren't exactly where I'd left them. Small adjustments, Subtle shifts in position that could have been explained by settling or my own faulty memory, but which felt deliberate in a way that made my skin crawl. I tried to sleep, but kept hearing sounds from downstairs. The soft whisper of cardboard against hardwood, the barely audible scrape of something being dragged across the floor. Each time I worked up the courage to investigate, the house was exactly as I'd left it. Boxes standing in their silent sentinel rows, moonlight streaming through unfamiliar windows to paint everything in shades of uncertainty. By morning, I'd convinced myself that exhaustion and stress had played tricks on my mind. The story about Ray being in the hospital had to be some kind of misunderstanding. People got their wires crossed all the time, especially in families as scattered as ours. I'd call Karen later, straighten everything out, laugh about the confusion over coffee and toast. But when I came downstairs, the boxes had moved again. Not dramatically. They were still in roughly the same rooms, still bearing the same labels in my own handwriting. But their positions had shifted during the night, rotating slightly, clustering in different configurations. And there was something else, something that made my breath catch in my throat. The boxes were forming arrows. In the living room, 3 book boxes pointed toward the hallway. In the hallway, a cluster of clothing boxes aimed toward the kitchen. In the kitchen, the remaining boxes, dishes, electronics, miscellaneous items, all pointed toward the back door, their edges aligned with mathematical precision. I stood there for a long time, trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe I'd been more tired than I'd thought. Maybe I'd arranged them this way myself and forgotten. Maybe the house was settling, shifting the boxes through some natural process I didn't understand. But even as I ran through these explanations, I knew they were lies. The boxes had been sealed when Ray and I brought them in, their tops folded and taped with machine-like efficiency. I hadn't opened a single one. There was no way they could have moved on their own, unless Ray had done it before he left. The thought should have been comforting, but it only made everything worse. If Ray was in the hospital, unconscious since yesterday morning, then who had helped me move? Who had known exactly where everything should go? Who had navigated through my house with the familiarity of someone who'd been there before? I followed the arrow trail through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms. The boxes led me to the back door, and beyond that, across the overgrown yard toward the garage. The building looked even more decrepit in daylight, its wooden sides weathered to a dull gray, its windows so clouded with dirt and age that I couldn't see inside. The door was unlocked. I should have left then, should have called Karen back, or the police, or anyone who could help me make sense of what was happening. Instead, I found myself pushing the door open, stepping into the musty darkness of the garage. The space was larger than it looked from outside, filled with the accumulated debris of decades. Workbenches lined the walls, their surfaces buried under layers of dust and forgotten projects. Tools hung from pegboards like sleeping instruments, and the air smelled of motor oil and something else, something organic and sweet that made my stomach turn. But it was the far wall that stopped me cold. Dozens of clocks covered every available surface, their faces staring out like unblinking eyes. Grandfather clocks, wall clocks, alarm clocks, digital displays, all of them frozen at the same time. 11:47. And in the center of this temporal shrine, sitting on a small wooden table, was Uncle Ray's watch. I'd given it to him for his 60th birthday, a vintage piece with a leather band and a face that had aged to a warm amber. The inscription on the back read, "Time spent with family is worth every second." It had been corny, but Ray had worn it every day since. The watch was still ticking. I picked it up with trembling hands, feeling its familiar weight, the slight warmth of the metal case. The hands pointed to 11:47, just like all the other clocks. But as I watched, the minute hand began to move. Not smoothly, like a normal timepiece, but in sudden, jerky increments. Click, click, click. The sound seemed to echo through the garage, and I realized that all the other clocks were ticking now too, their combined rhythm creating a discordant symphony that seemed to pulse in time with my heartbeat. The air grew thick and heavy, and I found it hard to breathe. I needed to leave. Needed to get back to the house, pack whatever I could carry, and drive away from Rochester as fast as possible. But as I turned toward the door, something made me stop. The workbench nearest to me was covered with newspapers, all folded to the same page. The headline read, "Local man dies in single car accident." Below it, Ray's face smiled out from a grainy photograph, and the timestamp at the bottom of the page read yesterday's date. But the accident had happened at 11:47 a.m., the same time displayed on every clock in the garage, the same time Ray's watch had been marking when I found it. I picked up one of the newspapers with shaking hands. The article was brief, clinical in its details. Ray had been driving home from a job interview when his car veered off the road and struck a tree. The impact had been severe, but he'd been alive when the paramedics arrived. Alive but unconscious, exactly as Karen had said. The strange part was the dateline. The newspaper claimed to be from tomorrow. I dropped the paper and backed toward the door, but my foot caught on something heavy. Looking down, I saw a box, one of mine, with my own handwriting on the label. It read Ray's Things in block letters, but I had no memory of packing such a box. I'd never had any of Ray's possessions. The box was open, its contents scattered across the floor. Photographs, letters, a coffee mug with a chip in the handle. All of them things I remembered from Ray's apartment, but which I'd never owned. At the bottom of the box, wrapped in tissue paper, was a small wooden figure, a carving of a man in a leather jacket, so detailed that I could make out the texture of the clothing, the lines around his eyes. The figure looked exactly like Ray. I picked it up, and the moment my fingers touched the wood, the garage exploded into motion. Every clock began chiming at once, their hands spinning wildly as if trying to catch up with lost time. The newspapers scattered in a whirlwind of yesterday's promises and tomorrow's certainties, and somewhere in the chaos, I heard a voice that sounded like Ray's. Some houses just feel right, you know, like they're waiting for you to come home. But the voice was coming from the wooden figure in my hands. I dropped it and ran. The house felt different when I burst through the back door. The boxes were still there, but they'd rearranged themselves again, this time forming a perfect circle in the living room. At the center of the circle sat a single item, Ray's leather jacket, folded neatly as if he'd just taken it off. I approached it slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The jacket was warm to the touch, and when I lifted it, I caught a whiff of Ray's cologne, the same scent he'd worn for as long as I could remember. There was something in the pocket. My fingers found a small slip of paper, folded in half. When I opened it, I found a note in Ray's handwriting. "The clocks in the garage are all wrong. Time doesn't move forward here. It moves sideways, touching moments that haven't happened yet. I tried to help you move in, but I keep getting confused about when I am. The watch knows the truth. 11:47 isn't when I had the accident. It's when I'm going to." I stared at the note until the words blurred together, trying to make sense of what I was reading. If Ray was right, if time really did move sideways in this place, then maybe he hadn't been helping me move yesterday. Maybe he'd been helping me move tomorrow. Maybe the accident was still going to happen. And somehow in this house that existed between moments, he'd found a way to reach backward and forward simultaneously. But that was impossible. Had to be impossible. I called Karen, but the line went straight to voicemail. I tried Ray's number and got the same result. It was as if the outside world had ceased to exist, leaving me alone in this house with its watching boxes and its secrets that existed in the spaces between seconds. The sun was setting again, painting the walls in shades of amber and gold. I stood in the living room, surrounded by the circle of boxes, holding Ray's jacket and trying to decide what was real. The logical part of my mind insisted that I was having some kind of breakdown, that stress and isolation had finally pushed me over the edge. But the jacket was warm in my hands, and I could still hear the ticking of Ray's watch from the garage. Tomorrow, according to the newspaper, Ray would have his accident at 11:47 a.m. But if time really did move sideways here, then maybe tomorrow was just another word for yesterday. Maybe the accident had already happened, was happening now, would happen again in an endless loop of moments that touched each other like circles within circles. I looked at the boxes one more time, trying to understand their message. They'd moved throughout the night, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed to mean something just beyond my comprehension. Arrows pointing toward the garage, a circle surrounding Ray's jacket, silent sentinels watching over a house that existed in the space between when and what if. And I realized, with a clarity that felt like ice water in my veins, that I might never leave this place. That I might spend the rest of my life moving boxes that rearranged themselves, listening to clocks that ticked backward and forward simultaneously, waiting for tomorrow's visit from someone who was already gone. The watch in the garage was still ticking, marking time in a place where time had no meaning. And somewhere in the space between 11:47 and forever, Ray was still trying to help me move in, still trying to warn me about the accident that existed in the future's past. I put on his jacket and walked back toward the garage, where all the clocks were waiting to tell me what time it really was. In this house, it was always 11:47. It was always the moment before everything changed, and I was always just arriving home,